Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that's the Fenway Park announcement. This is the program on constitutional government, and this is our 14th biennial election analysis meeting with the same two characters, Bill Kristol and Bill Galston. We feature both parties in our election analysis, which I will boastfully assert is the only such arrangement in all of Harvard that you will find. On the other hand, I'm not sure that either one of them is totally what President Donald Trump would approve of. Not 100%. And 100% is what it has to be. These are two experts in instant analysis. Since the election took place 2 days ago, they're doing some hard thinking and calculating. Instant analysis, it's often criticized, but on the other hand, what else is there but instant analysis in politics? Where is the comfortable platform in between instant analysis, which is too soon, and hindsight, which is too late? So here they go with their instant analysis. We've got a program this afternoon, 4 to 6. We'll be here with presentations by each of them. Then perhaps they will exchange a few words. And then we'll turn to questions and answers, and we'll have a mic for the audience, so you can all ask a question. And then at 6 or thereabouts, we'll take time out for supper, barbecue supper, delicious or acceptable, whichever you want to say. And then at 7, come back for a little more Q&A for another hour or so. And that's what we're planning to do. And we're hoping that everyone who's here will have time to be satisfied by asking and getting a satisfactory answer to the question that they present. So now let me say something to introduce each of them. And I'll begin with Bill Galston, who's going to speak first. Is that right? Is that all right?
I'm not sure it's been arranged, but
all right.
As they say in committee meetings, hearing no objection.
Hearing no objection. All right. This is what we usually do, and because Bill is always so well prepared. Bill Galston is the Ezra Zilka Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also a college Park professor at the University of Maryland. He's a graduate of Cornell, got his PhD in Chicago, and he has a number of honors and awards, which too many actually to list. He's got important books. His latest is called Anti-Pluralism: The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. There you are with a title that tells you what he's going to say. He's also a substantial and prominent contributor to liberal political thought. He's got The Practice of Liberal Pluralism, and earlier another book on liberal pluralism, The Implications of Value Pluralism for Political Theory and Practice. An excellent fundamental book called Justice and the Human Good, and his first book, which I always like to mention, Kant and the Problem of History. So that's Bill Galston. Then we've got Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol is the founder and editor-at-large of The Weekly Standard, a political commentator on TV networks, several of them. He's said to be, by Wikipedia, a vocal supporter of the Never Trump movement. I'm not sure how much that ever got to be much of a movement. So, but
I think Max Boot had the last word on that.
I see.
all right. He also went to Harvard and got his PhD also at Harvard in the department, on the very own Department of Government. I'm proud to say a student of mine. He taught political philosophy and American politics at the University of Pennsylvania and also the Kennedy School at Harvard, and then went to Washington, served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Education William Bennett during the Reagan administration, and then Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle in the administration of the first George Bush, where he was dubbed by the New Republic as Dan Quayle's brain. More of an insult to Dan Quayle than a compliment to himself. He's also written books, and he is the editor and commentator and interview of the famous Conversations with Bill Kristol, with many important people. And this under the auspices of the Foundation for a Constitutional Government, a close ally of the program on constitutional government, which you are now here for. And so let's begin. And you, Bill Galston, want to say what you're going to say?
Well, thank you so much, Harvey. As always, we're going all the way back to 1992. I've been talking nonstop about the election since it occurred, which means that my reputation for careful preparation is going to be sorely tested on this particular occasion. But I do want to put some facts out on the table, if that's not too horribly retro, and then a little bit of interpretation. And let me begin. I'm sorry, am I not close enough to the microphone? All right, I will lean into it. Thank you, Sheryl Sandberg. Let me begin with what I think is the most striking fact about this election, the one incontestably historic fact about this election, and that is turnout. The numbers at this point are highly preliminary, but if the early estimates are anywhere near true, total turnout was in the neighborhood of 49%, which is the highest since 1966, which was also 49%, and within hailing distance of the all-time high, which was in 1914, which was only 51%. So this was one of the most massive mobilizations of the electorate in modern history. If you want a recent benchmark, in the immediate past midterm election in 2014, turnout was 36.4%. So on that baseline, or from that baseline, turnout went up by fully 1/3. This is truly remarkable. And it's even more remarkable that in many respects it was a symmetrical mobilization. That is, there was a huge outpouring of Democrats relative to the baseline, but an almost as large outpouring of Republicans as well. And that is why each bubble, the bubble represented by the partisans of each political party, believed that its party was going to do very, very well, because what they felt was an enormous surge of energy on their side, and they couldn't imagine that it would be matched by a surge of energy on the other side, but so it was. And let me give you just one example, which is not a trivial one: the state of Florida. Let's compare apples to apples. That is, the gubernatorial race in Florida in 2014, and the gubernatorial race 4 years later in 2018. In 2014, you add up all the votes cast for governor, it's about 5.9 million. And Mr. Scott, the Republican, won by about a point. Add up the votes cast for governor of Florida in this year, in 2018, it adds up to 8.1 million, an increase of 2.2 million voters. For those of you, who can do math in their heads, that's about a 37% increase. But guess what? The Republican, Ron DeSantis, won the governorship by about a point. So despite the increase of 2.2 million, it was about 1.1 million on each side, and the overall result was the same. You can't imagine a more symmetrical mobilization than that. It wasn't always the case, but in many, many places it was. A fact about this election that has been more widely reported is the increasing division of the country along geographical lines, with Democrats doing extremely well in the big cities, very poorly in rural areas and small towns, and breaking exactly even with Republicans in the suburban areas, 49-49 to be precise. Now, this is of significance that goes well beyond the borders of the United States. If you look at the rise of populist parties and movements in the US, the UK, and in Europe west of the Urals, the pattern is exactly the same. In every country that you look at, almost without exception, the capital cities and the large metropolitan areas are the centers of resistance to populist parties and movements. The small towns and rural areas are the centers of activism and mobilization for those movements. And this is important politically, because what you have, instead of cross-pressured voters, as in the good old days of pluralism, what you now have is geographic, demographic, economic, cultural, and religious sentiments all aligned within each group. So the metropolitan areas tend to be more diverse, more highly educated, more located in the portions of the economy that are growing, et cetera, et cetera. And for small towns and rural areas, it's exactly the reverse. And so, interestingly, the day after the election, you have leading Republicans saying that the Republican Party needs a new suburban agenda. And you have prominent Democrats saying that the Democratic Party needs a new rural agenda. So stay tuned. I can tell you that people have been thinking hard about a rural agenda within the Democratic Party. A group of us at Brookings are about to come out with a major paper on economic policies for rural areas in the next couple of weeks or so. I would argue, and I don't want to press this argument too far, that after about 20 years of politics played between the 40 or the 45-yard line, what we are seeing at long last is a real realignment of the American party system. I put that out not as a fact, but as a surmise. And it's not clear to me that these trends are going to be easily reversible. Certainly, I don't think that they're going to be reversible in 2020 because this realignment is very much rotated around the axis of Donald Trump, not just his distinctive personality, personal traits, and views, but also the distinctive positions that he holds on a number of issues that turn out to be much more popular with the Republican rank and file than they were with Republican elites, whether you're talking about elected officials or donors. There is a world of difference between Donald Trump and Paul Ryan. Everybody remembers Donald Trump's announcement speech after he came down the escalator. Everybody remembers what he said about Mexicans. Hardly anyone remembers what he said about entitlement programs. But here is more or less a direct quote. He said, "We have to save Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid without cuts." That is not Paul Ryan's position. That is not the Koch brothers' position. It has not been the dominant position in the Republican Party for quite some time, but it turned out to have major appeal at the grassroots. So I think that for all sorts of reasons having to do with the ability of the president to focus attention on himself and his agenda, the trends that we've seen since November in 2016 are likely to continue through 2020. That has important implications because, among other things, it will shape the way new and young voters enter the electorate. Interestingly, the Democrats racked up 62% of first-time voters in this election. Many of these are young people, and they did almost as well among first-time white voters as they did among first-time minority voters, which means that there is a risk for Republicans that the pattern established early on in a voter's voting career will become hardened, and it will be very hard to break that pattern. So here is some news for Democrats, good news for Democrats, beyond the obvious, beyond the more than modest, though less than dazzling gains that they made in the House of Representatives. Good news point number one, because there are many more conservatives than liberals, Democrats have to do quite well among moderates, and they did. They got 62% of the vote from people who call themselves moderates. That has something to do with the fact that they did much better than previously in suburban areas. I've already commented on first-time voters. There was a long time where Democrats were winning upscale professionals and downscale ethnic and racial minority voters, but doing very badly among middle-class voters. This time, Democrats actually carried middle-class voters 52 to 47. Of equal importance, the most rapidly growing portion of the electorate regards itself neither as Democrat nor Republican, but independent. 4 years ago, Republicans carried independents by a margin of 54 to 42. This year, the numbers were the same, but the party labels were reversed, and it was Democrats who carried independents by a margin of 54 to 42. There was other good news for Democrats. They appear to have netted 7 governorships. That number may vary a little bit. And they took 323 seats in state legislatures away from Republicans. This is significant for all sorts of reasons, including, obviously, the impact on redistricting, because all of the Democratic governors who are now in office, I think perhaps with one exception, will be in office in 2020 and 2021 after the redistricting. And they are in a position, even if they're facing Republican legislatures, to say, no, we're not going to go along with this redistricting plan. And that will make it very much more difficult for Republicans to repeat in 2020 the extraordinary redistricting success they had after the 2010 census. Another area of good news for Democrats was in the Midwest, which was the cockpit of the 2016 election, and I think very likely to be the cockpit of the 2020 presidential election as well. Consider the following numbers. The governor of Pennsylvania, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, was reelected by 17 percentage points. In Minnesota, the incoming governor, Mr. Walz, was elected by a margin of 12 points. In Michigan, the incoming Democrat was elected by 9 points. And in Wisconsin, where Scott Walker waged a tenacious battle for his third term, he fell short by 2 percentage points after a series of very narrow victories. Now, why is this important? Well, Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, which Donald Trump took in 2016. Michigan has 16 electoral votes, ditto. Wisconsin has 10, ditto. Those 46 electoral votes added to the states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 are enough for an electoral college majority. Here's an exam question for you. Of the states that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016, which, if any, do you think that Donald Trump is poised to take away in 2020 based on his current performance, which is not likely to change very much, and his character, which is not likely to change at all? The right answer to that question, I believe, is 0. Okay, and that tells you everything you want to know. Now that the Democrats have been reminded of the constitutional fact that you win the presidency in the Electoral College, a wake-up call that they are not likely to hit. They're not going to hit the snooze button and go back to sleep on the Electoral College, I can tell you that. There is going to be a laser-like focus on the Midwestern states where they did a lot better than they did in 2016, and where the signs are that the voters who are not deeply committed to one party or another found Mr. Trump perhaps a little bit too rich for their blood. There was good news for Republicans as well. As I said before, the House losses, though a defeat, were relatively modest by historical standards, particularly with a president whose approval rating was far south of 50%. They have an enhanced majority in the Senate, which means that Senator McConnell can go ahead full bore with what he regards as his single most important duty, and that is confirming judges. I think it is also the case that President Trump will have fewer difficulties with new appointments to the executive branch than he would have had if the results in the Senate had been a little bit different. In addition, the Republicans held not only the state of Florida at both the senatorial and the gubernatorial level, but at the gubernatorial level in Ohio, the Republican candidate won by a surprisingly large 5 percentage point margin. And in Iowa, where a moderate Democrat, Mr. Hubble, had some hopes, the Republican nominee prevailed by 50 to 47. This suggests to me that of the gains that President Trump made throughout the Midwest in 2016, Iowa and Ohio are going to be particularly hard nuts to crack. It's going to be hard to claw back that territory, I believe. Not impossible, but difficult. which will only intensify the focus on Pennsylvania and the upper Midwest, which I believe will be absolutely central to the 2020 presidential election. How long have I been rattling on, Harvey?
No, keep going.
Yeah. Well, I'll give it another 5 minutes and save the rest for the second round. I do want to talk a little bit about some important developments that had nothing to do with elected officials, but have to do with the people acting directly through referenda. And here there were three particularly striking results that I want to call to your attention. First of all, after a long period of languishing in policy discussions in Washington, D.C. and some state capitals, redistricting reform moved into the public square big time, and redistricting reforms were adopted in Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, and apparently by a narrow margin in Utah. That's about a 5,000 vote margin. There are a lot more votes than that out, so I'm not adding Utah to my list definitively. But in fact, it turns out that when people have a chance to vote directly on this issue, as opposed to the legislators voting to preserve the status quo, there is some significant support for change in the direction of a more neutral process. The proposition that voters ought to choose their representatives and not the other way around is quite persuasive when you just put it that simply, and people are responding. Referendum item number 2, Medicaid expansion. As you will recall, the Supreme Court, in a split decision for the Affordable Care Act, held that the states could not be compelled to expand their Medicaid programs, although, of course, they preserved the option of doing so. Well, 3 states opted to expand Medicaid eligibility up to 138% of poverty: Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah. Notice anything about those states? Those are bright red states. But the logic of Medicaid expansion is turning out to be quite persuasive. And I would point out that when Medicaid was enacted in 1965, it took 17 years until all 50 states had decided to join the program. By that standard, the Affordable Care Act is on a fast track. And it strikes me as extremely likely that 17 years after the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion will be universal or nearly universal throughout the United States. That would be a big step forward towards making insurance coverage almost universally available, though not quite. I've saved the really big one for last because I find it particularly remarkable. This is Amendment 4 to the Florida Constitution, which restores the right of about 1.5 million felons to vote in the state of Florida. 1.5 million. Florida is a state that has been balanced on a razor's edge for the past decade, politically speaking. Of the 1.5 million, nearly 1/3 are African American men. Do the math. That's the number that was reported was about 420,000. Suppose that 1/3 of them participate in the next statewide or presidential election. It's 140,000. That will net for Democrats between 120 and 130,000 votes, unless extended incarceration has turned them in a conservative direction. Permit me to doubt it. So this creates This creates a new political dynamic in a state that has been painfully evenly balanced for more than a decade. I can't venture to predict how it's going to work out, but I will say that there is likely to be quite an energetic effort to register these people in advance of the next, in advance of the 2020 election. We shall see, but of everything that happened on Tuesday, it is the single development with the most potential for changing the political dynamic in the United States. I would point out also that the re-enfranchisement of felons was not a partisan act in the state of Florida. The two lead sponsors of the re-enfranchisement were, number one, the ACLU, and number two, the Koch brothers political network. As a matter of fact, they cooperated on this. And this is a sign of something larger in our society, and that is that criminal justice reform has become a bipartisan issue, where Democrats and Republicans, for very different reasons, have come to the conclusion that the 30-year push towards increased and extended incarceration has overshot its mark and in many cases has done more harm than good. So another longer-term prediction I have coming out of this election is that at some point in the not-too-distant future there will be renewed momentum for bipartisan criminal justice reform, which nearly got someplace in the Senate of the United States during the past 2 years. There's lots more to say about 2018, but that will do for an opening statement.
Now, Bill Kristol.
It's hard to believe we've been doing this since 1992. I will note that in 1992 it was a good time in American politics. I think in retrospect, we just won the Cold War without firing a shot. The world, there were some problems in Yugoslavia, but the world was in decent shape. We'd come off a pretty good decade economically. We were replacing a very fine man, I think, as president, George H.W. Bush, with a very skilled politician and someone who turned out with some, question marks one could put next to his name, but to be a pretty effective president, Bill Clinton. And ever since Bill Galston and I started doing this, things have been going downhill. That's,
True.
Causation is not correlation. I believe that's an important social science principle, but it is striking. I'm very good to be here. I'm, of course, deeply offended by Harvey Mansfield mocking the Never Trump movement as barely large enough to be a movement. The best movements are the smallest movements, I think, isn't that? Surely that's a principle Harvey would agree with.
Too small to split.
Yeah, I scorn large movements, And I also have been running around like Bill, and I was actually in New Hampshire over the last 36 hours, which is pretty interesting. I can talk about it for a minute, maybe later, but I always count on Bill Galston to come with all the facts, so I can just make assertions and depend on his facts. So I'll do that. I won't be precise anyway. I remember some facts or factoids, and the truth is often these facts do change a little bit because the exit polls aren't, and people quote them as if they're the gospel or actually real facts, but the exit polls are notoriously unreliable. They're still arguing about how much they were off in 2016. Even the vote totals, which are more like a real thing as opposed to poll results, which are extrapolations, there's still a lot of votes coming in. So some of these things are it's probably almost more accurate to be not to claim too much accuracy in terms of these facts. But I will mention, I'm glad Bill began with turnout. I was actually going to begin with that, too. That's been a little underreported, I think. That really is startling. I guess it looks like, 115, 120 million votes. Presidential years, with the 2016 election, we had, I think, 140 maybe, 145 million votes, something like that. So we are now in an off-year election, which traditionally is way below presidential. 2/3 is kind of the rule of thumb. Now up close to a presidential level than I think this year's off-year election will be closer to the last presidential election in turnout than to the last off-year election. So that's good, I guess, if we think it's a good thing that people vote. I suppose we do, as Democrats. I think wasn't there always, I vaguely remember this from college or grad school, some dissident social science argument that actually, large participation doesn't necessarily correlate with happy politics, and there's a case for a kind of, in some happy political situations, for sort of just people being too, not worried enough to vote. And it is actually striking that I hadn't done the research that Bill mentioned. 1966 was the last time, the highest turnout in an off-year election since then, and 66 was the middle of the Vietnam War, race riots and all kinds of tense things. So presumably people turn out to vote when they're unhappy about the situation the country faces. And if you get mobilization on both sides, which really is what is most striking about 2018, I agree with that. I mean, the typical wave election, one party mobilizes, usually against the party in power, because the party in power is overreached or alienated voters for some reason, and that's why it's a wave. One party is energized, the other one is either average or even dispirited, and then you get a big swing every way. This way, in this election, you can see it perfectly in the House and Senate results. Both parties were mobilized, and that's rare in American politics, and I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a not unimportant thing. And it fits into, I guess, what is my main point, which is we really do look like we are, it is red. This election was red America and blue America, but even more so. Or it was 2016 and even more so. Or it was the culmination, or maybe not the culmination, but for now the culmination of trends that have been going on for quite a while. I mean, Ron Brownstein, who writes very well, I think, on this current moment in our politics, and especially on the character of our two parties and the public who vote for each party, the way Ron put it before the election, but I think he's now, since the election, said that he was right, and I think he was. The trench between the parties will already pretty wide and pretty deep, will get, he predicted, wider and deeper, and it has gotten wider and deeper, just as a kind of analytical fact. I mean, the Democratic Party is even more upscale, combination of upscale to upper middle class, you might say, urban and suburban, along with minorities, and the Republican Party is increasingly rural, ex-urban, less well-educated, less well-off, and that is a pretty amazing reversal from 56. Sort of a slow motion realignment over decades that's happened with respect to, especially to wealth and the two parties. So the two Americas really are red America and blue America, marched to the polls, and each voted pretty predictably, I guess you would say. And we have, therefore, the Republicans picking up red state seats in the Senate, and the Democrats picking up what now you'd have to, some blue districts that were sort of held by moderate Republicans, and other districts that are moving purple or blue because they are basically upscale or medium scale, I guess maybe is a good way to put it, suburbs of big cities. Brownstein points out in a piece that he just posted this morning that a lot of, they don't have to be cities in the Northeast or on the coast either. Houston suburbs, Phoenix suburbs, I mean, Oklahoma, city, I mean, metro areas are there. The blue dots in red states are increasingly blue and are enlarging a little bit as they get out of the city itself to the areas around the cities. And these blue dots are not so small either. And one reason Texas was so close is Texas is an urban state. I think 2/3 of the residents of Texas live in cities or suburbs of big cities, big-ish cities. Houston and Dallas and San Antonio are very big places, So there's plenty of vote there for Beto O'Rourke, and didn't quite make it this time, but obviously made it a very close race. I mean, another way of putting this, the education thing is really pretty extraordinary too. The single best predictor, apart from race, I think, and ethnicity, for your vote now probably is education among white voters. If you're well-educated voters, vote Democratic. Less well-educated, not so well-educated, well, it's not the right word, less credentialed voters, taking into full account the character of the education people get these days, tend to vote more Republican. But it is pretty astonishing. I mean, you really, I was with Paul Begala, worked for Bill Clinton, a friend of Bill's, who is a very bright analyst of these things, practitioner as well. And we were chatting, it was 2 weeks ago, and so the 2 seats that Democrats had to reach, so to speak, to pick up. I mean, everyone figured they might pick up Nevada. They did. Arizona came close. And then could they get 1 or 2 more to compensate for the red states they might lose? And everyone was looking at Tennessee and Texas. And I said to Paul, the polls were sort of not that different for the 2 states. And Bredesen, the Democratic candidate in Tennessee, had been a very successful 2-term, I think, governor there. And so I said to Paul, which do you think is more likely to come through, Tennessee or Texas? And I would say the conventional wisdom was actually Tennessee a little bit more. I mean, Texas, that's just always the dream that never comes through for Democrats. Tennessee, and Paul said, Tennessee is hopeless. Tennessee has I'm making this up, but it's something like the 44th highest level of education in the United States. It's an old state and a not very well educated state, and it's therefore going to be a Republican state. Texas has some things. Texas is such a diverse state. They've got everything, but they have quite a lot of actually, obviously, well-educated people, as well as a lot of big cities and minorities. And Texas, he thought, would be closer, and it was pretty close, about 2 points. Education is so the education gap is really big among white voters. The gender gap is big. That was much covered. Suburban white men actually moved away from middle class, upper middle class. Suburbanites generally moved away from the Republican Party under Trump. So actually the gap looks a little smaller than it might have been just because they were both genders moved. The age gap is pretty huge. Republicans and Democrats in the House vote, looks like Republicans probably won by maybe a point or 2 of voters 45 and over. Democrats won voters 18 to 45 by something like very close to 2 to 1. They won 18 to 29, I think, by 70, more than 2 to 1. So we really do have this mobilization of 2 populations who are quite different from each other. And I mean, the joke someone made about this is we don't really have elections anymore. Every 2 years we have a census. And there's some truth to that. I mean, it's not, I would use another phrase that's been popular, demography is destiny. And we are now having demographic mobilizations more than actual elections in which people make arguments and convince each other. Now, we've always had those to some degree, and it's a bit of obviously it'd be nostalgic to pretend that once upon a time everyone just, listened to the arguments and voted as they thought best, and there was no way of predicting people's vote based on education, income, race. Obviously, that's never been the case in America or any modern or any, I suppose, non-modern democracy. But it does seem more demographic than it used to be. And I mean, I personally think that's not a great thing for the country. I mean, the divisions are a little harder to overcome probably if they are based on things that are harder to change than simply, well, I'm convinced by this opinion here and then I change my mind. They do seem to be increasingly baked in. They mirror the economic divisions, the cultural divisions, the sociological divisions, if that's the word, sort of compound each other and have kind of perverse network effects, to use a term that's become very popular, I think, in economics and business schools and so forth. But, you only start talking to people who agree with you, and then you agree with yourself even more, and people move to be near people with whom they agree, and they watch TV networks with whom they agree, and Facebook and all the social media stuff is well known. And we do seem to be in a bit of a cycle now of all of that leading to these 2 Americas mobilizing against each other. There are many, many interesting sort of tidbits along these lines. One is, and Brownstein points this out also, the voters are pretty different from each other. So to take an easy example, well-educated white voters, 40-60 approval of Trump, not well-educated, meaning college degrees, no college degree, high school or some college, 60-40 for Trump. Now 60-40, 40-60 is not, you could say, and I'd like to say when I'm being optimistic, and that's not that huge a gap. I mean, 2 and 5, 3 and 5. We're not talking about 90-10 versus 10-90. That would be sort of more like, heading towards civil war. I made this point once, and someone said to me, I don't know, but you do get civil wars actually when the vote is when it's a 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 break within each community. Where isn't it famous that a third of the American colonists were loyalists or whatever? I mean, it's not so. So I don't know whether it's to be I don't know whether to be spooked by 60-40, 40-60, or to be slightly reassured by it. But the main point I make is it's going in the direction of greater difference between the two parties. When Romney did very well against Barack Obama, after all, first African-American nominee and president, with white working class voters, everyone said, well, he's kind of maxing out with those voters. And that was not the case. Trump clearly just really continued to pick up more and more of those voters, and the same is happening in a sense on the other side. Brownstein points out that also the parties, in terms of their elected officials, not just the voters, are more and more different. So the Republican Party in the House is going to be very overwhelmingly white, more male than it was before the election, because several somewhat higher percentage of Republican women represent these swing districts, which went Democratic. And so like in my district in Northern Virginia, Barbara Comstock lost, other Republican women lost. They didn't nominate many women in competitive primaries. And so Mia Love, African-American woman from Utah, lost in a district that again proves the sort of urban point even in red states, you know. So the Republican Party will look very white and male in Congress, and pretty old actually, because again, some of the younger people who had just won in swing districts got knocked out. The Democratic Party will be less than half white male. A lot of women, I mean, this was fairly well known that there were many, many women candidates, many of them I think very strong candidates actually, and a lot of minorities of various kinds. So the parties, I mean, when you look, this would actually be an interesting little sociological sort of thing. I mean, the photo of the class on January 5th or whenever they get sworn in, really, the two, if they do it by, you know, if they break the two into parties, really will look startlingly different. They'll look more different in a way than the voters even, for obvious reasons, but it sort of captures, I think, the gulf between the parties. The gulf between the parties is as much, I don't know what to say, ethnic, cultural, economic, sociological as ideological. And as I say, those things do sort of start to reinforce each other at some point. And I think we're in that kind of cycle, which is probably not, all in all, a great thing. It's sort of amazing. I mean, I remember when college, it seems to be, I vaguely remember, that wasn't the kind of overwhelming, the consensus was that modern media, communications, transportation, mass production was going to, level out all these differences, right? Weren't we going to become more like each other? Wasn't that the general concern or the general prediction of students of modern society? And somehow, in fact, we seem to have managed to separate into two clumps that are pretty startlingly different from each other. I don't know. This would be an interesting historical question. Are they more different than, 175 years ago, 150 years ago? That would be an interesting thing to look at. And I'm sure there were huge differences then. Obviously there were. But they weren't supposed to really happen, I don't think, to exist in 2018. Someone, I can't remember who, made a good, interesting argument that you now have sort of the worst, not the worst, but you have a striking paradox in a sense. You don't have real decentralization, but you do have modern mass communications. So that in red America, everyone is watching Fox News. So it's not like, so red America is parts of red America are getting less different from each other than they used to be. Parts of blue America are getting less different from each other than they used to be, because you have the New York Times, NPR, et cetera. But red and blue America are getting more different from each other than they used to. I'm sure the social scientists have worked all this up, and some have some terms for it, but it's sort of this homogenization within each part of the society, but not maybe among the whole society. So you don't get the benefits of Tocquevillian decentralization, genuine local responsiveness and so forth. That's really what's most strikingly gone. In the House, you used to have all these congressmen who were not from the right party for that state or region, but they were locally popular, prominent, established, whatever, and they would win. That's really gotten difficult in the modern era, on the one hand. So you get the disadvantage of the sort of mass media and other mass effects cutting against decentralization, but you don't get what would presumably be an advantage of at least tamping down differences and partisanship and hatreds, between different parts of the country, because at least everyone's sort of getting the same, doing the same thing. So I think that's not an entirely happy picture, of America. Maybe not entirely, maybe I've overstated it, but it is a little, it does feel to me, that, not feel to me, but it looks to me, just from the data and from obviously just watching things, that it is a little more that way than it was even 5-10 years ago, and quite a lot more that way than it was 30-40 years ago. So blue America and red America, demography being destiny, mobilization, that's the term Bill used, and I think that's accurate, and partisan operatives use it now, as opposed to argument or convincing people or even opinion. You know, I used to talk a lot about public opinion. People don't really talk about public opinion much anymore, you know. I mean, it does, of course, matter, and people's opinions matter, and they change depending on events and to some degree, and arguments to some degree, and what issues are most prominent. But it is striking. You could get pretty close to predicting the vote in an awful lot of these elections without a clue as to what issues are being discussed, what the positions of the individual candidates are on those issues. If you know the demography, so to speak, you can get pretty close to the electoral result. And my instinct is that's not a great thing for the country. Which party is it a better thing for? I mean, that's a little hard to say. That depends a lot on sort of some of the flukes of what happened in any particular cycle. But here I think I basically agree with Bill, and I think it's pretty, just factually, pretty clear. Let's put it this way. So the House vote looks like it's now like plus 6%, I think, Democratic nationally. It's a little hard. These figures are a little misleading. There are some districts where there's not an opponent, you know, so that they don't even bother to run someone from the other party if it's so lopsided. So you know, then you miss some vote that would have been cast. California has the top two primary systems, so there are districts where there are two Democrats running, so that all gets counted as Democratic vote. Some of the California vote isn't in yet, about 3 or 4 million votes. When you try to wash those out, the country basically looks like it voted about plus 7%, you know, 53-46 Democratic, all in the House races, which is probably the best proxy for the national vote, since it's not a presidential year. And indeed, the House ended up about 53% Democratic, 53 to 54% Democratic. The House looks like it'll be just as all the concerns about the Democrats redistricting, reapportionment, the Democrats unfairly are going to be penalized, though that has been the case in the past. Is not the House is going to represent the actual popular vote for the House, amusingly enough. Quite looks right now like it's quite very, very close, actually. So that'll turn out to be something that everyone was alarmed about, but struck by, that turned out not to be particularly relevant, perhaps, in this election. Senate's 54%, I guess, right? Republican, 54 out of 100, because it's by states. If you do the population of the Senate, I think you get to the Democrats have the majority. The Democratic senators represent most of the country. Obviously, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote over Donald Trump by 2.5 million, something like that. Donald Trump got drew an inside straight in the Electoral College and wins the Electoral College. So basically the country, if you had to say it's blue America and red America is a little larger right now electorally than red America. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that governors, Republicans looks like they'll have 27 governors, Democrats 23, but the 23 Democratic governors will govern about 54% of the nation's population. So again, that seems actually pretty steady to be. The Democrats are, low mid-50s, Republicans are mid-high 40s. That's kind of where the public is. Democrats have won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections. Electoral College, the Senate helps Republicans quite a bit. The Electoral College helps Republicans not quite as much as the Electoral College. The Senate doesn't help, but the Senate helps Republicans for obvious reasons as well. And that's kind of where the system sits, right now, where the balance of power between the parties sit. I mean, it's a very unpredictable time. I'll come back to that in a second, in my opinion. But, just looking at it, if one assumed, which probably would be a mistake, no huge surprises, shocks, changes over the next couple of years, you'd have to assume, I think Bill is right, sort of hard to see any states that Hillary Clinton won that a Democrat, unless they nominate someone far to the left or in other ways a really unattractive candidate, which is not impossible. So that's an interesting question, which Bill can discuss in terms of the dynamics of the Democratic Party. Very interesting and important question, honestly. If the Democrats nominate someone relatively centrist, or I would even say center-left, but not Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren is an interesting question of where she counts on this spectrum. But leave that aside for a minute. It's sort of hard to see them losing any states that Hillary Clinton won. I guess New Hampshire and Minnesota, I think, were her two closest states. New Hampshire's very small, Minnesota would matter, and that actually is a sort of Trump trending state, or Republican trending state to some degree. Very white state, and older state, though I think also well-educated, so it cuts against. New Hampshire and Minnesota are both the same, actually. They're both older states than the average, but they're also better educated states than the average, and those two often do correlate. I mean, younger people have more education than older people in America and all around the world, but in this case, they kind of cut against each other. So hard to see that Democrats lose much, if anything, that Hillary Clinton won. And I agree with Bill. I mean, Florida is always very close. Republicans hung on there, so it's not clear which way the momentum is in Florida. I mean, talk about two countries, though. There were two countries, of course, there's red America and blue America. There's like red, within states this happens too. As I was saying before, blue dots in red states. But I mean, Florida is a particularly amazing example, because I was following Florida, and a few others were, on election night. And I mean, you look at the returns from southern Florida, and then you look at the returns from the Panhandle, and it is really astonishing. I don't know why it's astonishing. It's a huge state, so why shouldn't they be that different? And I guess states have always had huge differences between them. Illinois, downstate in Chicago, famously, way back when. But it really is just, you can sort of see it almost in real time as the Panhandle comes in 5-1 for DeSantis, and then Miami-Dade and Broward come in 2-1 for Gillum. And then very much mirrored, incidentally, in the Senate race. That's another kind of proof of the demography as destiny. Bill Nelson is not really the same person as Gillum, and on the Democratic side, DeSantis and Scott are quite different as Republicans. And the amount of ticket splitting in Florida, I mean, of course, there could be some both ways as negating each other, but I'm just going to guess that, I don't know, 96% of Floridians, maybe it's 94% of Floridians, voted a straight ticket. And certainly they look incredibly alike, the two races. So it's, again, an example that's of the way in which the particular characteristics of the candidates, their positions seem to matter much less, their experience, their background, their biographies, than just people who are just mobilizing on one side or the other. So anyway, I agree with Bill that, and so that would leave, for the Democrats, they would have to pick up, if they don't pick up Florida, they would have to pick up, obviously, one of the famous 3 states that went to Trump, Pennsylvania, breaking liberal hearts. It's really the only good thing about election night in 2016, I've got to say. I mean, the result wasn't that good, but the breaking of hearts was, you had to enjoy that a little bit, if you've been on my side as long as you have. It was so bad, though, with Trump that I couldn't even enjoy it. That's when I really knew that I was truly never Trump. I couldn't even enjoy liberal anguish. That was a bad sign. So Michigan, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin both elected Democratic governors and senators by comfortable margins, as Bill said. And Ohio split. I mean, Ohio elected a Republican governor by 3-4 points, I think DeWine ended up winning by. But Sherrod Brown, who's a pretty liberal Democrat, actually, got easily reelected by 8-9 points in Ohio. So I'm not so that's tougher for the same demographic reasons as the others than the other 3 states. But now Trump only needs to, if he holds Florida, he only needs to hold to in one of those states, I guess. So, but they were all very, very close in 2016. And just on a pure kind of, mathematical kind of analysis of who's voting, of what's most likely, I've got to think you'd have to favor the Democrats in 2020 if it's sort of a repeat, no big surprises, no big shocks sort of election. But final point, I mean, I think the odds are there will be surprises and shocks of various kinds. It's a very, so it's a weird combination of both demographic mobilization and in a certain way, stable or slowly moving, glacially moving coalitions in our politics that are quite recognizable in a way, on the one hand, but then in terms of everything else that's going on, obviously very fluid, both parties with significant differences within them. Now we have a split Congress, which is always unpredictable how that works out and who ends up winning and losing, various fights that they're going to have on legislation, and then a president who's extremely unpredictable. I mean, I really think it's just who knows where we'll be in a year and a half, 2 years, let alone in one year I was up in New Hampshire. One reason I was up there, I was mostly just doing a panel in Manchester, but I also went around and saw some Republicans to see how much interest there was in a primary challenge to Trump. And I wouldn't say there's, right now he looks strong. Most Republicans approve of Trump. On the other hand, they're so proud of being the first in the nation primary that you can appeal to their pride and say, well, you guys want to have two primaries, not just one in 2020, right? It'd be boring for the Republicans if they don't get to, the 9,000 Democrats are going to be up there and you just have to, rubber stamp some guy. So they kind of like that. And they're used to challenges to incumbent presidents. But I was struck that this week, actually, I've seen some polling that confirms this, that I'll just say a word about the Republicans, and maybe Bill could talk about the Democrats if he wants after. 85% of Republicans approve of Trump. If you go to look at a focus group, and I saw one recently, they want to defend Trump. They voted for Trump mostly, 90% of Republicans. Half of them reluctantly, I would say. More of them didn't vote for him in the primary than did, obviously. You got about 45% of the Republicans all in the primary. But they get sort of irritated when someone like me says, it seems like a never-Trump person, or when liberal media or liberal politicians or others berate them for supporting Trump or tell them they're horrible people for supporting Trump or excusing Trump and so forth. So there's a certain defensiveness which makes them want to say to pollsters they approve of Trump. About 60% of Trump supporters strongly approve of Trump, but about 40% somewhat approve of Trump. So in this focus group of the in the polling, we just did Iowa and New Hampshire for obvious reasons, in this particular poll, a pretty good chunk of the Trump approvers aren't necessarily in favor of renominating or reelecting him. And in the focus group, it was actually comical. I wasn't there, but I was told about it by a colleague and looked at the transcript they did after. So it's how these things go. It's behind a one-way mirror, and there are 15 people there or something, and there's a moderator. And so these are reluctant Trump voters in suburban Columbus. So very upscale, kind of people who probably preferred Kasich or maybe Rubio, but they've ended up voting for Trump in the general. Do you approve of Trump? Yeah, he's getting stuff done. Some of the policies are good. Democrats are bad. Liberals are unfair. I don't like the tweeting, and he's vulgar and all, but it's better than Hillary. Better than Hillary. That is an extremely important part of the Republican support for Trump. Sarah Longwell, my colleague, halfway through, the moderator came to see her and said, a colleague in this little enterprise, Defending Democracy Together, came to see her and said, well, what should we do? They seem to be kind of pro-Trump. I mean, what do you want to find out now? And she said, well, why don't you ask them, see what they're thinking going forward. So the moderator comes back in and says, so you guys, you all seem pretty okay with Trump. I guess you're on board for renominating and re-electing him. And sort of with one, they were sort of, I'm not so sure about that, I mean, some disruption was good, but we can't just have disruption forever. And the divisiveness, I like the fact that he, talks tough and talks, tells it like it is, but I don't know, it's too much divisiveness. Can't we work across the aisle a little bit? And I mean, it is funny, not funny, I think it's a reasonable position actually, right? You approve of a fair number of things. You're not willing to sort of just, he's president anyway, so what are you going to do about it? But that doesn't mean you're on board for an additional 4 years. That would be, I think, the intra-Republican question is, how many people are there like that? I mean, there's clearly 10% who are just anti-Trump, and they'll be there for whoever runs against Trump, 15%, maybe 20%, depends on the economy and other things, by 2020. But how many approvers of Trump would be open to a serious challenge against Trump? And I think that number could end up being higher than people think, especially if there's some, and right now he's benefiting from a very strong economy, obviously, and no obvious foreign policy fiascos or no consequence yet of various foreign policy fiascos. I mean, that's what's striking again in this focus group. This is right after the meeting with Putin, and their attitude was, I didn't really follow it. I mean, he's got to meet with the Russian president. I mean, they're like a big country and they have nuclear weapons. And, if he has to be nice to them, a little nicer than he really believes, so what? Nothing's happened, have they? They haven't invaded some new country. And it was true, right? I mean, so, if something happens, I think a lot of that changes pretty quickly. But I think there's more of a chance of unrest and disruption and chaos in the Republican side than it looks like right now, I guess is the way I would put it. At this time in 1966, no one thought Lyndon Johnson was going to have a serious challenge from Gene McCarthy, and no one thought Bobby Kennedy would get in after Gene McCarthy wounded Lyndon Johnson, and that Johnson wouldn't even run for, would end up pulling out after New Hampshire. And to take a milder version, no one at this time thought Pat Buchanan was going to challenge George H.W. Bush, which he did, and did a lot of damage to us in New Hampshire, and really laid the groundwork, I would say, for Perot getting 19% and so forth. So these things can move more quickly than people think. I do think, especially in the modern context in this modern world we live in, things can move more quickly, just in terms of media and communications, fundraising. We saw that with O'Rourke in Texas. If you catch on, you can raise a ton of money and all this stuff. Well, you can't run against Trump as he has $100 million, Beto O'Rourke raised $38 million in one quarter. I mean, if someone caught on as an alternative to Trump, you get a lot of Democrats' money, but that's fine. No one asks your affiliation when you send in your money online. So I guess I'll put it this way. Maybe I'll just close with this as a thought experiment almost. I mean, I think the truth is, beneath all the chaos, beneath all the excitement of the last 24 years, or maybe since '92, since the end of the Cold War, 26 years now, or maybe I would even say back to 1980, so what would be the last 38 years, it's been a fairly, at some level, the system's been migrating, as I've been saying. The parties have been changing character, but it's actually been fairly stable. I mean, in the simple sense that we've had 3 8-year presidencies in a row, presidents elected and reelected. That's never happened. That hasn't happened since 1824, right? That original, younger part of the founders' generation, where they had 3 8-year presidencies in a row. Each president has not been challenged for renomination in his own party. Some of the people who were running at the end of that period were running at the beginning of that period, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton being the most obvious examples, but Bush's and, were all over the place. And I mean, it is actually startling. And the issues were not that different, I would say. You could come post-Cold War kind of foreign policy challenges. 9/11 obviously is a big interruption and exclamation point, but by now that's a long time ago, and it's back to the kind of messy, complicated post-Cold War foreign policy, a lot of similar issues in domestic policy, and so forth. So it is a little startling to me. I mean, for all beneath the surface, I think those politics were not as, the changes were less consequential, perhaps in retrospect, than we thought at the time. And if you go back to '80, you got Reagan for 8 years and then Bush for 4. So you had a 12-year presidency, an 8-year presidency, an 8-year presidency, an 8-year presidency, and parties swinging back and forth, but not changing that much, becoming more polarized, I would say, but not fundamentally changing that much. Pretty evenly balanced. 2000, I was talking about Florida, Florida was evenly balanced in 2000, and it was evenly balanced last night, 2 nights ago. And so, surprisingly unvolatile politics, I guess is the way I'd put it. That's not the way it always is. I find this, especially talking to younger people, that they think, well, I guess that's how American politics works. Presidents just get renominated and then they get reelected. From 1960 to 1980, think about those 20 years, 1960 was a boring, conventional election, vice president against a senator, very, very even. People slightly wanted to change, as they sometimes do. Certainly the Congress didn't change at all, Senate and House held by Democrats. So that looked like it was a continuation of a period that had gone from the end of the Cold War, really, into World War II. Then you get all the turmoil of the 60s, which politically is manifested in, obviously, gold order. The gold order rights take over the Republican Party in '64. Johnson wins a massive victory. Johnson, as I said, challenged in his own party in '68, can't even be renominated. Nixon comes back, of all people. Wallace gets 5 states as a third-party candidate in '68. Nixon wins a narrow victory. '72, Nixon wins a landslide. Pretty unusual in American politics to have a landslide for one party in '64, and then 8 years later, a landslide for the other party. But in '72, the McGovernites take over the Democratic Party, so the Democratic Party suddenly is not the party of Kennedy, Johnson, Humphrey, etc. '76, Jimmy Carter, totally unknown in '75, wins the nomination, probably the most obscure candidate to win a nomination coming from nowhere in the modern era. It used to happen sometimes at conventions, but not through primaries. Ford challenged by, who's Nixon driven from office, Ford challenged by Reagan, almost beats him in the primary. 1980, Carter challenged by Kennedy, almost beats him in the primary. Reagan comes back, moves the Republican Party from a Nixon-Ford party to a Reagan party. John Anderson splits off and runs as a third-party candidate. actually looks sort of like he's going to be formidable for a while, but ends up with 6-7% of the vote, and Reagan wins. So no 8-year presidencies, parties flipping wildly back and forth in their support, huge social and cultural turmoil, obviously, foreign policy, et cetera, Vietnam. So that also is, a picture of American politics over 20 years. I somehow have the hunch that the next 20 years will look more like, for better and worse, more like 1960 to 1980 than like 1980 to 2016 or 1992 to 2016. And that's why I do think that simply assuming that we're going to rerun 2016 in 2020 it may be a mistake. Now, the thing that cuts against that is what I said earlier and what Bill said, which is the parties themselves is the mobilization and the polarization. So, but at some point also one suspects the polarization runs its course somehow or becomes, I don't know, maybe it doesn't run its course. That's a huge question. Brownstein likes to say, I'm advertising Ron so much, but I did a conversation with him, so he's on my mind. Ron likes to say that this decade reminds him of the 1850s. He just doesn't know what comes next. And there's some truth to that in terms of the hatred, almost the ascription of bad motives to the other side, the escalation, the toying with, let's call them, it's not unconstitutional, but sort of pushing constitutional norms, not just by Trump, which is bad, but McConnell in 2016 with the Supreme Court, and Democrats before that getting rid of the filibuster, and a sort of back and forth that is not that unlike what happened before the Civil War. But presumably we don't have slavery, we don't have a Gulf of that kind. It's not really quite as regional. Presumably it's not really a pre-Civil War moment, so it's hard to know what it is, honestly. I mean, is it it seems like the political bitterness and Gulf, it's still unclear what it's grounded on. I mean, are there really that huge differences in the actual lived lives of Americans in red America and blue America? It doesn't really seem so. They seem to know each other and mix perfectly well in the military and elsewhere in all kinds of ways, not just the military, but, in sort of civic and social life. And then somehow in politics, there's this real division. It feels to me like an unstable and sort of untenable situation. I don't know quite what replaces it. But as I say, I think it's unlikely that we sort of chug along in a predictable way over the next 10 or 20 years, and maybe even over the next 2 years.
Do you want to talk to each other now, or should we move directly to questions from the audience?
I would do the latter.
All right. Let's go. Do we have mics? I think.
Don't you want to say something about I'm serious about the Democratic Party? I think I'd be interested in your analysis of, does it change the balance of power? Does Tuesday night, what does it say about the much discussed balance of power in the Democratic Party between, quote, moderates and, quote, progressives?
Well, here's my suggestion, Bill, that since it's been a while since the session has started, I suspect that I will have a chance to answer that question in response to the floor, and if that doesn't happen, then
shameless ducking of the question. But
no,
that's okay.
No.
At 8 o'clock, he's going to be, I think time is up. What can you do? I was like, you will.
I am not shy about that, but I think the audience has been patient.
All right. Yes, go ahead.
I'll try to talk loudly enough. This is a hypothetical question for either or ideally both.
Wait a moment. Yeah.
This is a hypothetical question for either or ideally both bills. Let's suppose that during the next 2 years, Donald Trump should have the opportunity to replace one more, we'll say, liberal Supreme Court justice with a conservative one. That's premise number one. Premise number two, let's suppose that in 2020, Democrats win both the presidency and both houses of Congress. What do you think is the likelihood in that eventuality that a court packing plan would be passed by a Democratic Congress and Senate to basically reverse the consequences of Trump's nomination. And of course, this could be applicable even if he doesn't get to fill one more vacancy. Any ideas?
I will give you the obvious historical baseline example. FDR in 1936 won one of the largest victories, both on his own behalf and on behalf of the Democratic Party in history. And he immediately moved in the direction that you're talking about. And the public reaction, including from a substantial portion of his own party, was highly negative. The survey research I've seen on the subject suggests that the American people now are about where they were in 1937. And if any Democratic leader were foolish enough to ask my advice, I would say about packing the Supreme Court what I would say about impeaching the president. Don't go there unless you are much surer of your ground than you have any right to be.
I mean, I guess I would answer, I don't know what will happen. Bill's probably right that it'd be hard to actually pass such a thing. But I don't know, if he replaces a liberal justice, let's just say Ruth Bader Ginsburg or something, I think there will be a lot of pent-up anger at this minority president supported by a minority Senate, sort of, but let's just say it that way, a Senate that's only, whose senators represent a minority of all Americans, packing the court for generations. I think it'd be somewhat different if one of the conservatives, let's say Clarence Thomas, as has been rumored, steps down and is replaced by another conservative. That would be a little less fraught. But if that were to happen in 1919, let's say, and we get another bitter fight, I mean, I hope it's not quite like Kavanaugh, but you could imagine, God knows what would happen, right, with that nomination. I think, let's put it this way, I think at least one or probably more than one Democratic candidates in the primaries would run on that platform explicitly. And they would have some law professors supporting them, I believe some here at Harvard Law School. Isn't that right? Didn't Mike Klarman actually explicitly call for this about a month ago? And he's a very serious and distinguished law professor, actually. And so it won't look, I mean, it might not look quite as, I think one problem Roosevelt had is he didn't campaign on it, if I'm not mistaken. So it was like suddenly it's like, hey, we're packing the court, maybe we should get worried about the 1937 recession or something and, get back to the New Deal or whatever. So it was pretty easy for Southern Democrats to say this is just ridiculous. Whereas I guess I'm less confident maybe that wouldn't happen or become a major issue in American politics, both electorally in 2020 and conceivably in reality if a Democrat won the presidency in 2021. And I think it fits into the general notion that there's sort of an escalation on both sides that's been going on for a while. It may also be the kind of thing, these escalations go on until they don't go on, so maybe some overreach would lead to some reaction that would cause some in both parties to pull back. And that I sort of wonder when that happens. So I do feel that unlike slavery, just like the point I was trying to make, I mean, slavery is a real mobilization and escalation, but it was based on a very fundamental division that it turned out couldn't be bridged, That doesn't feel to me to be the case this time. So I actually think an entrepreneurial politician or set of politicians, either in Congress or conceivably at the presidential level, or conceivably breaking the two-party framework even, there's sort of, one can imagine a rapid or abrupt reversal, in my opinion, of the kind of political polarization, even though now it seems very far removed.
Let me just add a footnote. What would make your scenario much more realistic? If the court were unwise enough to overturn Roe v. Wade. And, here, this is what the exit poll, and it may be off, but it's not off enough to change this. How should the Supreme Court handle Roe v. Wade? Keep it as it is, 66%. Overturn it, 25%. If the court goes down that road, which some people will urge it to do on principle, and others for less noble reasons, I think that would trigger a popular revolt against the court that could very well lead to something like what you're talking about.
Man with the mic.
Hello. So I am a Michigander, and I care a lot about partisan gerrymandering. We were one of the 3, possibly 4 states to get rid of it via ballot proposal. We've seen in the past year or two, 3 other states at least had their map struck down by their local Supreme Courts and whatnot. And we've seen that a few other states have already moved to independent redistricting commissions themselves. What are the odds, do you think, of this happening on the federal level with the abolishment of partisan gerrymandering?
I actually think quite low. And I say that for constitutional reasons. And that is, if the Constitution gives the states primacy in determining the time, place, and manner of these elections. The state courts have been willing to intervene. They just did it in my home state of Maryland today, for very good reason, by the way. That's what the lawyers would call an argument against interest, because it will lead to at least one more Republican seat. But as far as I'm concerned, that is a just punishment for the shameless gerrymandering that the Democratic legislature engaged in. And if you look at what happened in Pennsylvania, the court intervened, and that made a difference probably of at least 4 seats in the House, and it could have been more. I think the process will continue to be a dialogue between the state legislatures, the state courts, and the people of the respective states. And I don't think the Supreme Court is going to get involved. It has declined repeatedly, pleading the incapacity to come up with a bright line rule that can be applied across the states. And so I think, as with Medicaid expansion, this is more likely to remain on the state level than to go back to the federal level.
And I would just add one word. I'm sympathetic to the case against gerrymandering for various reasons. I think I might vote against it if I were a citizen of a state that, I might vote for an Iowa type, nonpartisan. Just draw the lines as cleanly as you can into 4. It's a little easier in Iowa since they have 4 congressional districts, so you just divide the state into quarters. But of course, look what happened in Iowa. So the 3 more traditional, I think it's safe to say, Republicans, they flipped 3 seats in Iowa, I think, right? And the Democrats won those 3, and the one Republican who survived was Steve King. So the notion that gerrymandering is entirely responsible for more extreme positions in either party is not necessarily it's somewhat true, I think, because you get an all Republican or all Democratic district, and then the primary becomes more important than the general, and then then it becomes 51% of the party that's determining the character of the nominee, as opposed to, let's say, a hypothetical 51% of the electorate in the middle. But having said that, I think it's something that's maybe the gerrymander's contribution to that may be slightly overstated. I'm curious to see what happens in some of these states that are now not gerrymandered in terms of the actual character of their congressional delegations, as opposed to the partisan breakup.
By the way, I think that result in Iowa has theological implications, because one can ask whether a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and just would allow such a consequence. One of the 3 legs of that stool, I think, is too weak to bear the pressure.
Professor Trout.
I have the mic.
Okay, Mark, okay.
So my question, I think, is in the spirit of the one that you postponed from Bill. So one thing that didn't entirely light Democrats' fire in this election was the losses of all the marquee progressive candidates, right? Abrams, Gillum, O'Rourke, I'm probably forgetting some.
Cordray.
And of course, the excellent showing of so many moderate Democratic candidates, Rosen in Nevada, these victories in governor of Kansas, right? So my question is, first of all, given that so far all the candidates being spoken about on the Democratic side are from this progressive wing. As far as I can tell, I don't see a single moderate in the group. Is there a movement among good moderate Democrats like yourself to try to foster some kind of a moderate candidate? Yeah.
Yes, details to come. But analytically, first of all, the marquee progressives who failed did so for the most part in states that are either bright red or pretty pink. And I don't exclude Cordray's 4 or 5 point loss in Ohio, given what Donald Trump did to and in Ohio in 2016. The analytical point number 2, there is a lot of daylight between the Joe Bidens and Tim Kaines of this world and a lot of the others who are marching around the country getting much more daily press. And so there's a real dialogue going on right now between what I'll call sort of center-left candidates. I'd put both Biden and Kaine in that category, and people who are calling themselves progressives and who are clearly much more inspired by Bernie Sanders and that brand of politics. You can tell, here's a diagnostic for you. It's pretty, it's a sort of a silver bullet diagnostic. The distinction between Democrats with national ambitions who endorse Medicaid for all and those who shy away from it. Interestingly, a lot of visible Midwesterners like Amy Klobuchar and Sherrod Brown have declined to go down that road, and it's mainly the coastal Democrats who are most comfortable with that. Point number 3, there are active discussions going on with candidates who will be portrayed, potential candidates who will be portrayed as to the right of center-left. For example, the governor of Montana and also the former mayor of New Orleans. And they both have, quote unquote, their liberal credentials in pretty good order. But so those are 3 lanes. Bernie and the dwarfs is lane number 1. Biden and Kaine are lane number 2, and potential sort of classic, more democratic moderates in lane number 3. We shall see. It's not clear to me that there will be a single entry in lane number 3. That remains to be determined.
Let me follow up just briefly then, because the ones you listed among the centrists are not. It's very hard for me to see them winning Democratic primaries, whereas all the ones in the progressive wing seem to me have them that touch on the grassroots much more strongly. I mean, the ex-mayor of New Orleans, give me a break.
I don't know. Let me just say where it's.
I will.
Now I get to the question. If someone from the progressive wing runs, does all this pro-democratic momentum that I think both of you have cited that I entirely agree with, is that really enough to elect a progressive Democrat?
Here, let me give you once again 2 diagnostic answers to that question, and I don't claim omniscience as to what the right answer is, but these are the questions I would bring to bear on that. Number 1, following on my electoral college analysis, who is going to be much more competitive than Hillary Clinton was in the upper Midwest? Because the electoral college math is very clear. So that's putting it geographically. Now let me put it demographically. The greatest gains that the Democrats made were in suburban House districts. Those are potential converts to a Democratic presidential nominee, but not just any kind of Democratic presidential nominee. So, I would hope that one of the political questions that, that people who matter in the party will be asking in 2019 and 2020 is, who can check both of those boxes? I'm not going to give you a dogmatic answer, but those are the questions.
But I would just say, if you look at, so I think being a moderate Democrat, if you can just use that term very loosely, is worth 2 or 3 points just in many places in a general election, as opposed to being a more progressive Democrat. Gilliam's complicated because one has to assume that being African, probably a little bit more uphill to be the first African-American governor of Florida, or I guess statewide elected official, I believe, in Florida. He didn't run worse than Nelson. I mean, it was 0.4% worse. Now, Nelson had Scott was a better opponent probably than DeSantis, so I'm going to just stipulate that he ran, maybe he lost 2 points that Gwen Graham would have had if she were the nominee in Florida. I don't think it was 8 points difference. So I wonder how much, we all are interested, and for policy reasons and for other reasons. Bill's very interested in, the character of the party. It's empirically, I think, reasonable to make the case that the moderate Democrats did better in Virginia. So my district went 10 points against the incumbent Barbara Comstock because that was the classic, upscale suburban district that was just going to collapse. Clinton had won it. There are 3 districts that are weirdly similar to each other in Virginia 2, 5, and 7, which are all, Republican +4 type districts. In 2 and 7, the Democrats nominated moderate candidates, well, in both cases, women who with military experience in one case and a former CIA operative in the other. They each won very close by about a point. Leslie Coburn in the Charlottesville and surrounding district, who is a real left-winger, a pretty unabashed left-winger, as the Coburn family is. It's genetic, right? Lost by a couple of points, I think, to Riggleman. So I think there is some cost.
It was worse.
Was it worse? So that was striking. Riggleman's not a strong candidate. So there was a cost to being in a state like Virginia, I'd say, and probably some cost in Florida to being too far left. I've got to say, in the actual primaries in 2018, the Democrats didn't. Gillum really was in a way more, and Abrams perhaps more, it was mixed, I would say. There was sort of the exceptions that proved the rule. There was an awful lot of Ralph Northam in Virginia type, that was 2017, I know, but people like that winning primaries, certainly in the House primaries. They nominated more moderates than not. That's why they picked up a lot of these seats. In our district, for example, in Northern Virginia, they nominated a very conventional state senator who was not terrified, pro-business and all that kind of stuff, not the more radical candidate. And I'm a little unconvinced, I guess, by the narrative that so where does the primaries begin? Iowa, they elected a moderate Democratic governor who had beaten the more left-wing candidate, isn't that right, in the primary? And then she won the governor's race.
No, she did not.
She lost in Iowa.
No, the Republican won it.
In Iowa, that's right, by a couple of points, yeah.
Right. 50-47 against, I think, Fred Hubbell.
Right, that's right. But against a good, I was thinking of Kansas, but against, and then New Hampshire, Democrats won easily with a fairly moderate congressional candidate. I'm not so sure that the Democratic voters of Iowa and New Hampshire are so radicalized as one would think from looking at the activists and all that. And final point, just to be, again, contrary to my sort of actual interest or views, or wishes, but I don't know, Beto O'Rourke ran better than Hillary Clinton in Texas, right? Now, Cruz, I suppose, is less attractive than Trump. Well, but he is the incumbent senator in the state. Beto O'Rourke got more votes than Hillary Clinton. That is an amazing fact in the turnout situation. In an off-year election, a losing Democratic Senate candidate who had never run for local office, never run statewide before, certainly got more votes than Hillary Clinton running for president. So I don't know. O'Rourke's an interesting case. So I think O'Rourke was an energizing young voters, exciting, kind of Obama-like. He didn't really run that left-winger campaign. And obviously, I think the best thing, one way the Democrats could go is try to find the equivalent of that, or himself, I suppose, if he wants to run. You could imagine someone being energizing without being wildly progressive. Or maybe you can't. Maybe there are these litmus tests that the activists will set up, which you can't not sign off on, whether it's Medicare for all or Supreme Court backing or something like that. But I'm a little less sure that you could have a lot of cross-cutting. Sherrod Brown. So I would say if you came down from Mars and said, who should the Democratic nominee be? If there were old-fashioned convention party bosses, why wouldn't Sherrod Brown be the nominee? The guy wins by 8 points, I think it was, in Ohio. which, as Bill said, has become an increasingly tough state. He's got to be their best candidate in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. He's a sitting senator. He's been there for 12 years. The progressives love him because he's fairly ferocious on sort of working man, rapacious capitalism type issues. But his image isn't really sort of lefty, progressive, he's a working class kind of guy and all this. So I don't know, would Sherrod Brown count in the progressive lane or in the moderate lane? I mean, that would be, so I think these things are a little more, in the Democratic side, probably more than on the Republican side, frankly, a little more cross-cutting and confusing. And some of these candidates could, if they're clever, as Obama did famously, be both more progressive and also, hey, there's no red America, no blue America. I'm going to bring an end to partisan bickering in Washington. So, do you think that's possible or no?
An end to partisan bickering in Washington.
No, do you think it's possible that you could straddle that kind of progressive, moderate
Look,
thing?
Sherrod Brown is one of the last remaining New Deal Democrats, and so he is he's a pro-labor, pro-working man Democrat. To the best of my knowledge, he has not endorsed Medicare for all.
That's interesting.
And so it's a real divide.
Bob Putnam. Give him that's it. Thank you.
Like everybody here, I'm fascinated by questions dealing with the next 4 months or the next 2 years. But now I want to raise the time scale of our reflections and do it following Bill's idea, which I guess, Bill Galston's idea, which I guess you also endorsed, that this was in some sense a confirmation of a realignment that's been slowly underway for a long time. I think that is dramatically true, actually. I'm not going to make the argument for it, but I think it is very, very true. And I pose 2 questions. Let's assume for the moment that that's true, that increasingly the country is going to be divided between the metropolis and everybody else. And it's very dramatic because I think Oklahoma City is the really interesting case of that, because that's a very red area, but it's very blue in Oklahoma City on the map if you looked at it. So question number one, that's a conflict between places of dense population and places of concentrated population. Our Constitution is designed to give special advantages to states of low concentration. That's why we've had, over the last, whatever it was, six elections, Democrats have been winning all these elections, but not always winning the presidency because of that, because of the overweighting to rural states. If that continues and expands, as I think it's likely to, not the constitutional provisions, but the realignment, that's going to be at some point, it's not going to at some point be really constitutionally, I don't want to say untenable, but really difficult. If year election after election, these red states with almost no people there are outvoting the places where most of us live, that seems to me pretty undemocratic. So my question is for your reflections on that. It shows up especially in the role of the Senate. And the Senate has, as we're now seeing, a lot of power over nominations, especially judicial nominations. And the implication of that is that the discrepancy between the views of the country, of a majority of the country, and the views as represented in the Supreme Court, that seems to be likely to expand, and therefore seems to be likely to pose even more sharply the question that was earlier posed: is that really tenable? That's the constitutional question. The political version of that question is, what's the matter with Westchester? By that I mean, that alignment puts together affluent suburban districts and the poorest people in this country. And I wonder how tenable it is as a Democratic coalition to put together in the same coalition the people who need the money and the people who have the money from whom it's going to have to come. And I'm saying that, I'm trying to make the question crude so that it's clear, but obviously lots of rich folks, including probably many of us in this room. We're not rich, but we're in that upper category, but we would gladly pay higher taxes to help. But over the long run, I wonder if that's tenable, and I wonder if Westchester is really a tenable, Westchester being liberal is really tenable over the long run. That's the political version of the reflections on the realignment.
Who wants to go first?
You go. It's a lot of interesting stuff.
That's well. I agree with you that there is a tension between the Electoral College, for example, and the structure of the Senate on the one hand, and modern conceptions of democracy with a small d on the other. I think history suggests that our Constitution can take a lot of strain.
But but politics was never, except in the period of the Civil War, never the main dividing line in the country was not.
Okay, but let me demur on this one for a couple of reasons. First of all, as recently as 2014, Democrats had a substantial majority in the Senate. So maybe that was before the flood, maybe. But I note with interest that when Republicans in red states go too far, there's a very interesting reaction. Kansas just elected a Democratic governor, right? And why is that? I can give you a two-word answer: Sam Brownback, right? And so in many of the less densely populated states, there are classic sort of moderate to moderate conservative Republicans who will balk if they're forced to walk too far down that road. And I don't think that Kansas is going to be an isolated example. And so if there's a re-equilibration in the less densely populated states at the statewide level, then that could ease the constitutional tension. So I think the vector of your question is right, but it's the size of the vector, the amount of the strain on the constitutional system, and other ways that strain could be relieved politically as opposed to constitutionally. To say nothing of the fact that that the Electoral College and the composition of the Senate in particular are among the most entrenched features of the constitutional system, the best defended against change, particularly the Senate. And I know some friends of mine are interested in calling a constitutional convention, including a very fine law professor who teaches here half the year, Sandy Levinson, and he's much more sanguine about the outcome of such a procedure than I am. With regard to the unholy alliance that you point to, this is not new, right? And a colleague of mine with good Harvard credentials, Vanessa Williamson, has written a first-rate book that just came out earlier this year on what Americans really think about paying taxes. And the answer to that question is a lot more nuanced and in some ways optimistic for people who think that we are an undertaxed society at this point. It depends on what Westchester is being taxed for. But there are a lot of people in Westchester who, first of all, as Democrats and liberals, are not either on principle or viscerally opposed to a measure of redistribution. Secondly, there are a lot of them who take the position that they are willing to pay higher taxes for the right reasons. So ask Westchester whether they are willing to pay more for an infrastructure bill that wouldn't benefit primarily them, and I suspect the answer to that question would be yes. There's some other things that they could be asked to pay taxes for that they would resist. Here's another point about that alliance. Okay, There is a big difference, politically and in every other way, between the upper middle class in this country and the really, really wealthy on the other. And so the idea that if you're talking about the top 10% of the society, you're talking about a homogeneous group, as I'm sure you know, is simply wrong. There's a world of difference between a professional family making $400,000 a year and the truly wealthy in this country. And if you look at the most recent and much lamented tax bill, who were the real beneficiaries? Not the professional family in Westchester, but the people much, much farther up the scale. And so I suspect that this Democratic coalition could easily get together around the idea that reversing the Trump tax cuts is job one, and that would generate a lot of revenues without putting much of any strain on the coalition. As a matter of fact, a lot of those professional families would benefit more from the reinstatement of the state and local tax deduction, which was wiped out, than they would lose from lower brackets, which aren't that much lower for individuals.
Question in the context of the next 2 years. I was asking that context in the context, asking my question in the context of the next 20 years, and therefore abstracting from the particulars of this awful tax bill.
Well, I'll simply repeat the best evidence that I've been able to find so far from the work that now my colleague at Brookings, Vanessa Williamson, has done on what Americans really think about paying taxes. And I'll make an additional observation, and that is, as an aging society that is unwilling to rein in the costs of programs that principally benefit aging Americans, I think it is inevitable that the gap between spending and revenues that has been opened up will be filled much more on the revenue side than on the spending side. And so if you're asking for a 20-year prediction, we will pay a significantly higher share of our GDP in taxes to the federal government in 20 years than we do now.
But I would just, I think Sam Huntington, I recall Sam Huntington saying this, and I think the opening lecture of his class on American political development, which I took, but I don't know if he ever wrote it, so I don't quote him on this just because I vaguely remember it from 40 years ago, but he said something about how whatever social scientists or public pundit types come to agree on some big social phenomenon, you know that it's run its course and things are about to reverse. And he had
the owl of Minerva is flapping its wings.
Totally. I mean, he had this wonderful list of examples, and they were about, he even ascribed this to himself and his colleagues who he genuinely respected. And, Daniel Bell, extremely intelligent man, The End of Ideology. Yeah, that was, when did that come out? 1961 or something like that? And there are a million examples like this, obviously, of conventional. And so when Bill and I now agree, I suppose, and you too, on this, Red America, Blue America, and the polarization and mobilization, it'll probably change. And it really could, because things do have certain built-in, at least one hopes, and there are certain built-in reasons in a way why these trends run their course and reverse, either entrepreneurial politicians or shocks to the system. We're now living in a world of huge deficits where we can sustain, I don't know what the political implications are, which way it cuts, but we've been able to sustain the tax cut and pretty generous spending. Trump can be a tax cut deliverer for the very wealthy, to some degree, some tax cuts for everyone, I guess, for most people at least, and nothing on entitlements. And we don't seem to have paid much price so far. I don't think it's totally untenable, but which way does it cut? This is interesting. Just what if there's a big recession? I don't want to go back to just the next 2 years. I take your point about the 20 years. But what if there's a big recession in 2019 or in 2025? I don't know. Does that push the country left, right? Bill's written about this. If Trump sort of fails and is replaced by a Democrat who has trouble, maybe the recession hits on his or her watch, which is a little unfair, but that's life, and suddenly Elizabeth Warren's got a recession in 2022, and there's a huge reaction to that. Do we end up, does the Republican Party revert to what I would prefer, the more traditional conservatism, or does it go further in a Trumpy direction? The problem with Trump, this is quite often the case in European history. The problem with the initial populist is that he's not ferocious enough. He's not determined enough. He got co-opted. He had all these establishment people around him. And we need a real, younger version of it. I don't think that's out of the question. And on the left, there are many tensions. And as we've discussed a little bit, which is sort of hard to tell which way they go. So I do want to just put out the possibility, since we've been mostly agreeing that things could go in a lot of unpredictable ways. I was in Kansas City, Missouri, giving a talk sort of randomly about a week ago, so just before, a week ago tonight. So, it's interesting because, Kansas City, Missouri is in Missouri, but part of Kansas City is in Kansas, and it's always very confusing how that happened. And so everyone there, it was a charity function for the Red Cross. So it was your basic upper middle class people who give money to the Red Cross and get honored and so forth, and nice function. And so people were interested in politics. You had the Missouri Senate race, you had the Kansas governor's race, that's what's his name, Kobach, right, who lost, the anti-immigration guy. And then Kansas 1 is the district across the river or highway from the Missouri side of Kansas City. It's in that part of Kansas, sort of upscale, suburban. I think that's where the better schools are. So if you're an upper middle class professional, I gather, in Kansas City, you might well live there. And I think taxes may be lower in Kansas than in Missouri. And the woman who won that race is, and I'll get the details wrong, but a 29-year-old or something like that, Native American, lesbian,
kickboxer.
Mixed martial arts, not special, who won the race in this district. And I don't think the district is really full of, so this kind of cuts again, lesbian, mixed martial arts, Native Indians. I did notice that someone at CNN or someone featured this as first Native American in Congress, which I think is a real blow to Elizabeth Warren, well, I don't know. But anyway, so maybe more of this kind of stuff happens. It does make you wonder, I think, on the economic front. So our district was the classic, the Republican could win because people wanted more conservative economic policies, even though they were socially moderate or liberal, kind of the caricature almost of that. And they do seem now to be voting, you might say, against their class interests. Maybe that's easier to do in an off-year election because Donald Trump's president, so there's no chance that a Nancy Pelosi House is going to raise your taxes. They might try. And it would be very interesting to see in a presidential year where the issue is posed more squarely. I agree with that. Sort of where do my neighbors in McLean, Virginia go if it really looks like, we could have not just Nancy Pelosi, but we could have Chuck Schumer, or maybe even a lot more left-wing version of Chuck Schumer, and we could have, Elizabeth Warren or whatever, Sherrod Brown, let's say. Do they then come back and decide, well, that was nice to check Trump for 2 years, but, maybe we can go back to voting Republican for president? Maybe if it's Trump, they won't go back, but if it were traditional Republican, they would. So, there are a lot of, I agree, kind of cross-cutting cleavages at this point, potentially, in both parties, despite the apparent mobilization, polarization that's going on at the same time.
Let me this may be the last comment before dinner, and so I will I will keep it short, exactly. 2 points, Bob. First of all, the phenomenon of upscale liberals voting against their class interests is not new. As a matter of fact, there's a hoary tradition. I think it was Milton Himmelfarb who said that the Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans, and that is still that was the Jews. But there are a lot of people who vote like Jews, even though they're not Jewish. I'm happy to say. Here's the second point,
another problem,
and I'll throw this out as a provocation. Looking ahead 20 years, maybe we can talk about this after dinner, I would much rather prefer to be holding the Democratic Party's cards than the Republican Party's cards for all sorts of reasons. I actually am increasingly of the view that what we're seeing now is a kind of desperate rearguard action that will not hold back the demographic tides forever. And here's a straw in the wind. Republicans, let's face it, have become the party of white America, but they lost young white voters in this election by a very significant margin. So if the future is a lot more ethnic and racial minorities in the electoral pool, plus young whites who've grown up with this diversity and are much more comfortable with that than they are with rural white evangelical Christians, then over time, I don't think the Republican Party is a growth stock.
All right. Stop on that note and have something to eat.
So the floor is open. I'm Susan Schell. I teach at Boston College. I'm just here to moderate. As I said, not that anybody needs moderating. We're all moderates now. So, questions? Yes, Roberta. Yeah, wait for the mic, please.
You heard of pots and kettles, David?
How did I end up in this situation? All right. You talked a lot about the realignment of parties. I would like to know, to what extent are the parties responsible for our current problems? In that, the way they have reorganized themselves so that we are now totally dependent on this primary system, which we all know has produced the immoderate candidates, if I may be so bold as to say. The Democrats just reorganized themselves again so that there would be no superdelegates next time around. Where does this leave us, and why haven't the parties thought through what they need to do to have more influence rather than minimal now? The second point that I would like to raise, and this is just an issue that you made the point that the young white voters these are great prospects for the Democratic Party. And I would like to throw out a possible reason. If you look at what is going on in K through 16 education, I think you will find the answer. That all of them, all the students today, no matter where you go, whether it's a suburban school, an urban school, a top flight exam school, they're all being taught the same thing about how this is a fundamentally racist, classist, sexist society from its very foundations. And the attempt, I believe, is to undermine the very foundations of our nation.
I'm not sure quite where to go with that. So let me grasp the nettle firmly with regard to the first half of your question and say that the thesis that young Americans would all be Republicans if they were better educated is one that I have some difficulty with. But with regard to the first, I think you're absolutely right. I think that almost all of the party reorganization that's gone on since the mid-1960s has been for the worse, not the better. I have frequently said, which is one reason why I'm not in particularly good odor with my fellow Democrats, that if I had a choice between the party nominating system that we had in 1964 and the one that we had now, I'd pick 1964 without a moment's hesitation. Now, having said that, I think it's important not to overstate the additional damage that Democrats have just done, because in fact, when you look at what they've done, it actually makes it more likely rather than less likely that the superdelegates will have an influence over the final selection. Why is that? Answer. The superdelegates have not been eliminated. They are not allowed to vote on the first ballot. That is the power that they've been deprived of. But that doesn't mean that the denominator for getting the nomination has changed. It just means that in order to win on the first ballot, you have to get an absolute majority of the full delegate body without any superdelegates to help you. So you do the math, right? In order, if say, between 450 and 500 delegates are not available to vote, then you are going to need a super majority of the delegates that are selected through the primary and caucus system in order to go over the top on the first ballot. So like every other rules change in the past 50 years, this one is going to have unanticipated consequences that are the opposite of the intended consequences. You heard it first here, but we'll see if this is at all a contested nomination as opposed to one where someone actually walks away with a solid majority of the first round delegates, you are going to see a second round of voting for the first time in a very long time in a convention of either party. So that's to the first point. I'm agreeing with you, but just qualifying one of the points that you made about the most recent development. With regard to the second, I know what you're talking about, but I think that what's going on in our public schools is not nearly as monolithic or as consequential, for that matter, as you think it is. My own view, for what it's worth, is that a lot of young Americans of all stripes are more comfortable than not with what they see the country becoming. And it's not clear to me that what the country is becoming is a fundamentally attack on our constitutional order. I could easily make the argument that the more serious attack on our constitutional order is coming from very different quarters. So I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree on this one.
Bill, did you want to speak?
No.
Let's see. Yes, Jim Masbridge. Yes.
Bill, if I may, in your talk you said
Bill?
we somehow managed to separate into two clumps, and later you held out the possible hope that polarization will run its course. Recently, Frances Lee wrote a book called Insecure Majorities, in which she argued that since 1980, we've had highly competitive elections for the House and Senate. And it's that possibility of competition that produces a major cause of polarization, i.e., that as soon, what we look back at fondly as the period of nonpartisanship was a period of democratic hegemony, with a sun party and a moon party. The Moon Party had to make nice to the Sun Party. The Sun Party was factionated, had to pull from the Republicans. So if you think about that, and you think about Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act and allowing the two parties to be more homogeneous, I don't see polarization running its course. And I don't see that we somehow managed. I see these deep structural causes. Unless one party falls apart, and produces the hegemony of the other party for a long period of time, I don't see us going back to an era in which people reached much across the aisle. I think representatives will continue to reach across the aisle, but I don't think we're going to see anything like the surmounting of the veto points in the Constitution and the way that we've set up the. So what do you see? I mean, as you look that. If you agree with that analysis and you look it squarely in the eye and say, yes, we're going to have polarization for as long as I live, I'm old, how is the country going to handle that, do you think? So first is causes, second is the future.
I don't know the literature that well. And it seems plausible that a sun-moon system, if I can call it with Samuel Lavelle originally, is more conducive in some ways to working across, slightly one-sided working across the aisle, than, evenly balanced parties which fight bitterly because they're evenly balanced. I mean, I don't know. You can probably go around the world and find evenly balanced before you go into American
She's found
history.
it in the States as well, that the closer they are,
the
more polarized they are.
So, I mean, it could be. I mean, that could just be a natural dynamic, but there are also obviously times when that probably changes. So I'm totally open to the proposition, but I wouldn't be too deterministic about it. And other things could. So I'd say two things. I mean, events could really change the situation. It's not like the two parties are. I can imagine the parties breaking up in very fundamental ways. They now look like these two polarized monolithic blocks. Obviously, you could imagine a scenario where the Republicans really do crack up in a Trump and non-Trump faction. The Democrats now look more or less united, if not united, at least willing to tolerate each other. But one can imagine that changing in all kinds of, in several ways. So, I think that's not necessarily going to stay that way forever. Or one party could become a majority party. I mean, that would be the other thing that could change, and I don't think that's out of the question. I mean, really, as Bill said, the Democrats have certain structural advantages. And so on the second answer, I guess I would make is, well, then you really do depend on the Constitution and the other institutions of society. It is an argument for, I like to remind my liberal friends of this, an argument for limited government and for federalism. Some states are that way, but a lot of states aren't. And for the private sector and for civil society and so forth having a lot of weight. I mean, Trump really is a reminder of why you don't want everything to depend on who is the president of the United States. I mean, my oversimple version of this and my anti-Trump version of this is, we are not Argentina or Venezuela. I mean, Trump in Argentina or Venezuela could lead to Argentina or Venezuela. The judiciary gets corrupted, the media gets coerced, the chaos really spreads from the let's call it the White House, whatever the equivalent of the Oval Office is in those countries, through the executive branch very quickly, et cetera, et cetera. There are strong institutions in civil society, universities and stuff that do their own thing. The great thing about it, we don't deserve any credit for this. It was built up over 200 plus years, but we have an extremely thick and, complex society and institutions and, as I say, private sector, civil society, state governments, local governments, churches, and you name it, all, which don't think they're supposed to hop to it when the president has a whim. We have the executive branch doesn't think it's supposed to hop to it when presidents have a whim, maybe too much so sometimes that annoys presidents, but it's good that, in my opinion, the military has extremely complex procedures and rules, which are frustrating sometimes, but mean that when the president gets up one morning and tweets about expelling transgender soldiers, for example, Marines, as troops, servicemen and women from the military, that Mattis says, well, that's very nice, but, we have all these procedures for separating people, and if they came in legitimately, we would have to revise these procedures, and I'll refer to the General Counsel of the Defense Department, and nothing happens. And that's really not the case in a lot of countries. So I would say that even one could imagine very polarized parties fighting bitterly, but with not the ability to have the whole society or the whole government or even the whole executive branch become objects of bitterness. Now, you could also make the argument that it does spread out, and Kavanaugh would be an example of that, perhaps. It's hard for the other institutions to kind of keep a distance almost from that type of politics or that type of bitterness and partisanship. That would be an interesting question also to study whether other societies have gone through these extremely partisan moments, of 10, 20, 30, 40 years, while the society kind of chugs along, so to speak. One has a little bit of feeling that that's happening. My final point, I think I said this earlier, I'm genuinely just puzzled, like, what is the bitter partisanship about exactly? I know it's about, diversity versus, nostalgia for an older America and all kinds of social and economic issues and all, but it's a little, I don't know, there's something a little out of whack with the almost fanaticism of the partisanship on the one hand, the demagogic rhetoric and all this, and the actual things that are at stake. It feels to me like we have a society that is not, I wouldn't say wildly polarized. I'm sure sociologists have thought about how to study this and have studied it. It doesn't feel to me like it is, particularly, and a political system that's pretty polarized, though really polarized in Washington. The state capitals and cities is an interesting case study because a lot of those are sort of chugging along in a much more traditional way. Maybe that's because they don't have evenly balanced parties on that thesis. But so it's a more complex situation. you can miss a lot about America if you just read the headlines about what's happening in the Congress or with the president, obviously. And that's an interesting question of which is it a little bit almost self-generated by, I don't know what exactly, the parties, social media, various other phenomena, which doesn't mean it's not important, but also means it's not structural in quite the way that slavery is or, class warfare is or something like that.
Could I add a couple of comments? First of all, building off something you said almost in passing, we have gone through a very long cycle of the nationalization of a large number of political questions. And if the structure, the balance, the strife at the national level makes it impossible to act on questions that are increasingly urgent, there could be a downward movement of political responsibility for a lot of these questions, and that would have a number of advantages. Not only would it diffuse questions that either get a yes or a no answer at the federal level, and you have a sort of a patchwork system of answers to it, but also because a number of states are under, the majority of states are under unified government. For better or for worse, the states will have the ability to act in response to majorities, even though the majorities point in very different directions from state to state. So keep your eye out for federalism in the next generation, and you're starting to see Democrats writing articles about, quote, progressive federalism. So there's a straw in the wind. Now, on the question that you've raised twice, Bill, about, well, what is the polarization about? Brookings and a survey research outfit called the Public Religion Research Institute have been doing something called the American Values Survey every fall now for a number of years. And about 5 years ago, we started asking the question, do you think America's way of life is better or worse today than it was in the 1950s? And a supermajority of Democrats say better. A supermajority of Republicans say worse. So that is a pretty fundamental, all things considered, verdict on the changes that most of the people in this room have lived through. And I don't want to argue that competing and discordant answers to that question explain everything, but they do point to something that I think is not trivial. But now on your side, of course, Robert Frost famously defined a liberal as someone who couldn't take his own side in an argument. And based on what you were saying in your opening remarks, I think it's spreading. I'm not saying that you're becoming a liberal. What I am saying is that this indecisiveness is spreading across ideological lines, which may or may not be a good thing. Learned Hand would have thought that it was a terrific thing, but that's a different point. But in fact, as you look at issue after issue, you can see a majority running from the center right to center left. You say one standard deviation from the median, that is in fundamental agreement, and then the left and the right tails are largely driving the discussion, particularly at the national level. That hit Bob the wrong way, but I think there's substantial, we can explore this. And so if the American people were presented with a different choice, this goes back to Roberta's point to some extent, if they were presented with a more center-seeking choice, I think it would be interesting to see how the political system would reconfigure in response to that choice. I'm not talking about a third party, because I don't think a third party is in the offing for all sorts of reasons. Reason number one is that the American people, 2/3 of the American people say they want one, but then when you ask what kind of third party they want, they don't agree. It's not a party of the center necessarily. So I do think that there is, the two tails wagging the dog phenomenon that explains a lot of what's going on.
Peter, Peter Scary.
Yes, thanks. 2 years ago, I remember sitting here asking the panelists to consider the cultural dynamics of the electoral results, and Bill Galston, at least, dissented from that view 2 years ago. I think, based on what I've read of yours since then, I think you've begun to change your perspective.
I have indeed.
And your remark just now about the outcome of the Brookings poll, the divide you pointed to, seems to speak to that. Despite my focusing on you, Bill, this is directed at both of you. We've heard now different proposals about taxing for various kinds of programs who we might tax, or fiddling with the Constitution. I guess I'd like to hear programmatically what either one of you might offer that would speak to the cultural divide that is now seemingly so apparent. I don't mean to point this quite so negatively as it sounds, other than pointing out, which has been pointed out before, Bill Galston, that we're dealing with an increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller aging white minority, or white majority that's becoming a minority. It seems to me that's the perspective that's helped get us into the problem we're in right now. So with that, I guess I'd ask, how do you see us?
Fair enough. And I take some comfort from the fact that I'm not yet too old to change my mind. And the work that I did for the book on the rise of populism that I published the first month ago, which I understand you may have some familiarity with, led me to the conclusion that the central driver in the rise of populist movements, particularly recently, has been the immigration issue and the fact that it is a trifecta of issues, culture, economics, and security, all wrapped into one. I have written a series of columns in recent years, arguing for the urgent need to reach an honorable compromise on that issue. As you may know, Bill Kristol and I have gotten together to form an organization called the New Center, and next week we're going to be putting out a major paper through the New Center that lays out in considerable detail what the parameters of that honorable compromise might look like. And I don't think it's any accident that in the heat of battle, President Trump defaulted to that issue in the last 6 weeks of the recent midterm election. He understood full well that that was the issue that made him president, and that was probably the only issue that would arouse what he judged, probably correctly, to be a sleeping base. And I am not a demographic determinist when it comes to politics, but there are some big facts that smack you in the face. And one of the fundamental splits in American society, splits of opinion, is between younger and older voters. That's simply a fact. It is also a fact that the younger voters will be on the scene long after the older voters have passed from it. All other things being equal, that fact can't be devoid of political consequences. It just can't. In other words, I'm neither celebrating this nor deploring this. I'm simply stating what I view to be a fact. And that will create over time new majorities that some people in this room will celebrate and others deplore. But I view it, I view it as highly probable. But if just to complete this thought, when I began studying and writing about the rise of populism about 5 years ago, I thought, and I said so at the time, and I've said so confessing error ever since, I thought it was principally an economic phenomenon.
I no longer believe that, which is not to say that economics is irrelevant to the understanding of populism, because it is hard not to see a connection between the decline of the manufacturing economy and the conditions that have enabled the cultural dimension of populism to come to the fore. It's a complex interplay, but I agree with you now, the culture in the driver's seat.
Yes, Bernard.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you two questions. First of all, what effect is Romney, who has ties with liberal Massachusetts, who has gotten the support of Massachusetts, what effect will he have in the Senate? Is he going to be a strict diehard Republican, or is he going to be? And the other question I'm wondering about, what if we adopted ranked voting? What that would gotten rid of Trump?
I mean, I think Romney's. So the question was first implications of Mitt Romney being in the Senate, since he was once governor of Massachusetts. He's now the first person since Sam Houston, I believe, to be governor of one state and then senator from another state. And Houston was before the Civil War, and that's impressive that Romney pulled that off, I guess.
This is the equivalent of a baseball statistic.
Yeah, just a bizarre. I think they're the only two.
First one to steal 23 bases and
Right,
23
right.
home runs, and
the second
another obscure person.
And the second question was, what was the second question? Ranked voting. So, I mean, on Romney, I think, look, he's a major figure. I think there aren't really any anti-Trump Republicans to speak of in the Senate. Flake was probably as close as we had, and Sanders to some degree, but the not so crazy about Trump, willing to step up, stand up to him at times, Republicans, and which might be a little different, incidentally, in the second 2 years than the first. Romney will be a leader of that, could be a leader. I think will be probably a leader of that group because of his stature, obviously a presidential candidate, nominee. And so I think he'll be pretty important. I think one problem with it was the first 2 years was always going to be different from the second 2 years. Trump had won. He was advancing agenda that most of the Republicans more or less agreed with on a lot of issues and judges they liked. And so there was not much incentive to break. Now with losing the House, with 2020 looming, with the question of do you want another 4 years of this, not just how do we manage the situation we found ourselves in. As I said earlier, for the voters, it's no longer a better than Hillary choice. It's a do you want prospectively 4 additional years of Trump choice. I think Romney could play a pretty big role. Now, whether he chooses to, how he does, that's complicated. The Senate has its own dynamics. He'll be a backbench, one of the most junior senators and one of the most senior people in the Republican Party. It's an unusual sort of situation. I guess John Quincy Adams, but he had been president, just to take another historical oddity. Someone going from the presidential level back to Congress, that's pretty unusual. But he was an important congressman when he was there. To the House, yeah, it's amazing. But I think I don't have the sense the Romneys have a huge relationship anymore with that much of Massachusetts. Charlie Baker is a Romney heir, as governor of this fine state, incidentally, and
the most popular governor in the country.
Yeah, and so for all the polarization, incidentally, the governors do cut against it. I mean, there are plenty of governors who seem to govern successfully against the grain of not against the grain, with the grain, but from the other party of their state, and moderating, you might say, the natural tendencies of their states. I suppose that's kind of a sun and moon thing in a way. But it's interesting how many states that now exist, and they're just not organized, and everyone's told them they can never win a Republican primary nationally. And I mean, actually, objectively, if you look around, there are a fair number of these Republican governors. There are a fair number of moderate Democratic governors. Somehow it's somehow assumed, though, that at the federal level, they don't count as much, and at the national level, they don't have presumably successful prospects. So I don't know. That's not always been the case, obviously, with Clinton and stuff. So I don't know. I think Romney is interesting. Ranked choice voting, I think could marginally change things, though I think it'll be pretty marginal. I guess there's one congressional district it's now a question whether it will reverse the result, right, in Maine. And it'll be sort of interesting to see. But there's so few cases where, not so few, there are some, there are races where I suppose the Libertarian takes 2.5% and you get a 49, 48 8 result, and the ranked choice voting of that candidate could be, I'd say generally polling has always shown, since we haven't had much ranked choice voting, we have to depend on polls, that even though we sitting here would say, well, those libertarian candidates are really for the Republican, or those green candidates are really for the Democrat, the actual people who vote at the end in these protest votes are just, they hate both parties. When you actually poll them, they don't break nearly as much as you would think for the side that they're supposed to be sort of be on, you know what I mean? So I'm not so sure that the ranked choice will tip that much one way or the other. But we will have this little experiment. What is it, Maine 2, I think, which is close, and where have they gone to it yet? Why is it taking so long? I don't know. It's like shouldn't the computers be able to do the ranked choice thing? Is it really that hard? You know, it's like buying something on eBay or something. Anyway, I don't know. But anyway, whatever. That'll be sort of interesting to watch. I haven't followed it in the 2 days since the election, but there is one congressional district that will now be resolved, or may not will potentially be resolved by going to ranked choice voting. People know what ranked choice voting is. I mean, you put you up, just what it sounds like, you know, first, second, third, and then if your candidate doesn't make it, if someone isn't above 50% and your candidate doesn't make it, they have it in some cities in San Francisco, in California. San Francisco has it, and Cambridge has it. I don't know. My vague sense is that there's not much evidence it's changed much so far, but I don't know if that's the case here. I don't know. You've probably know more about it.
Yeah. See, it's a moving target because there's a complex interaction between electoral structure and the people who put themselves forward, and indeed the party system.
Right.
And so, in a modest way, ranked choice voting could work to the advantage of third parties and independent candidates who've really been dealt out of the equation up to now. And so, they might be less fringy if more of the system were on a ranked choice voting basis. But we're getting into the realm of speculation now. All we can say for sure is that we finally have a full state that's giving it a fair test.
Are you that man with the microphone?
Thank you. Thank you all. So I was surprised that neither of you brought up in your opening remarks the Kavanaugh hearings, and really you've only skirted on those so far, I think, before the dinner break. This seems to be indicative, at least to me, of some serious decline. I mean, to say that the discourse was uncivil, I think, would be an understatement. It was like everything underhanded possible, short of, let's say, violence. And we already know at universities, violence seems to be condoned in some quarters, or at least accepted. So I wanted to get, again, in the long term, let's say the 20 years, as the gentleman mentioned over there, what your thoughts are on what seems to be this utter decline. Anything goes in politics, no matter what, and civility seems to be all but unimportant.
Well, regrettably, the proposition that the end justifies the means is not confined to the Senate of the United States. But, you know, and I hope that this is a brink that everybody will step back from. And it certainly is the case that, you know, only one senator emerged from those hearings with anything like an enhanced reputation. And certainly, you know, politicians who may not be restrained by much else will be restrained by the electoral consequences, if any, of their conduct. But as to the politics of the Kavanaugh hearing, I have to reserve judgment on that, and here's why. If you look, one of the things that survey research asks is, when did you make up your mind? And it turns out that there is no discernible difference between the choices that people made before the Kavanaugh hearing and the choices that people made after the Kavanaugh hearing. Now, and regrettably, there was a second question that the survey researchers did not ask, namely, when did you decide to participate in the midterm election? And that question might have yielded a different result. But what I can tell you is that 52% of people who say that they made up their minds before Kavanaugh say that they voted for the Democratic candidate.
53% of people who said they made up their minds after Kavanaugh voted for the Democratic candidate. At least that's what they tell the survey researchers. But as I said, it is possible that the pundits were right, that Republicans who are more or less satisfied with the way things had gone during the first 2 years, but were not really thrilled about this midterm election, may have been mobilized into the process in response to the Kavanaugh hearing. But I can't argue with you about the tone and temper of the hearing. No sensible person could.
I mean, on the politics, I always think it's a good idea when people say, pundits on TV, and other disreputable types say that, oh, this is big, this could really change everything. It's worth asking yourself, do I actually know anyone whose mind was changed or is being changed or even conceivably could be changed, I would almost say, by this event that everyone is saying is so important? And, secondly, if you don't know them personally, they're one always thinks there are people out there. But I got to say, on Kavanaugh, I personally, I think know no one who changed his or her vote. I think it's possible that some people who might have been lackadaisical about voting, especially in red states where they thought Kavanaugh was being treated badly, and maybe in blue areas or purple, suburban areas where women thought that he was being treated too well, there was a little mobilization on each side, but it might have netted out, right? And it might have happened anyway in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, because there's always people get more interested in, they would have said, oh yeah, I better vote, and I'm going to vote the way I was going to vote. So I sort of think it's one of those funny, it was a big phenomenon in many ways. I think the cultural significance, it was kind of a perfect culture war moment in a depressing way. But I'm somewhat dubious just about the actual vote-changing character of it, and I think the mobilization probably offset a little bit. Probably a little bit, though. I think enough people anecdotally thought in red states that it was helpful to those. It was, after all, a Senate hearing. That it does seem like there was a move at the end towards the red state Republicans against the Democrats in those states who voted not to confirm Kavanaugh, right? I mean, Manchin, West Virginia is so different from Missouri and what would the other, Indiana, that one doesn't want to generalize too much, but Manchin is the one who survived in those states and voted with Kavanaugh, and Donnelly and Heitkamp, and Heitkamp would have lost anyway, I think, but Donnelly and McCaskill went down. So there may be a little mobilization there, and maybe a little reverse in a couple of these suburban Virginia districts I've been discussing, where women candidates were running, and a little bit more enthusiasm to send a message to Washington. In the House, it's not direct. You're sending a message. You're not electing someone or voting against someone who voted for that person. But having said all that, I have to say these things generally have much less of an effect than people think. I happened to be in New Hampshire yesterday, and there was a guy there who had been a consultant. He's a data guy on the DeWine gubernatorial campaign in Ohio. And he said, sort of version of what Bill said. There was clearly heightened interest and great depth of feeling on it among their voters in Ohio. And they did a little better in certain areas of the state. And then the bomber sent his bombs to CNN and to various President Clinton and President Obama and other such people. And then there was the Pittsburgh murder, and it all disappeared and it went the other way because of Trump's response to that. And he thought that is why it sort of netted out. So it's a little hard to know exactly. One thing on the culture, since I don't know. These things are harder to since we're all into the big trends and all this. But there are counter trends, and things go to reverse, and things turn around. I came to Washington in '85. Bork was in '87. Thomas was in '91. It was an absolute conventional wisdom among my friends, certainly, that we're just in a total new era of no holds barred. Every fight's going to be just an unbelievably bitter fight like this. We then promptly had 20 years, 25 years, I would say, of fairly uninteresting Supreme Court confirmation hearings. No one was denied confirmation. The votes were more partisan than they had been 30 years ago. Obviously, the Democrats voted against the Republican nominees. There was a little harassing of them at their hearings. But at the end of the day, they did threaten to filibuster, which led to the filibuster going away in the Senate. Or they did filibuster. So I'm not saying nothing happened, but it is sort of funny that it didn't, not every hearing became like that. The one person who was nominated for the court who was withdrawn was Harriet Miers, withdrawn because of conservative Republican opposition. But then this thing explodes. So these things can sometimes be a little more one-off and sort of perfect storm ish, than one thinks. And I'm not so sure that if Clarence Thomas, let's say, resigns and President Trump nominates, I don't know, a woman who's maybe not Amy Barrett, that would be pretty interesting, but maybe one of the other women, Joan Larson or something, who's on the list, and we just have a normal, and then he's got 54 Republicans, and she does fine in her hearing, and it's a normal Gorsuch-like event. I mean, I don't think that's out of the question. So I'm not so sure that they're all going to be this way. They could be, on the other hand, could be that way. The cultural thing is interesting. I mean, I very much think it is. Obviously, the 50s question is a good one. I mean, it's an interesting one because it does capture what's presumably mostly a cultural difference, and the coalition of transformation versus the coalition of what's restoration and all that kind of thing, and that some people have nostalgia of the 50s, other people have progressives by definition, think it's all gotten better, or at least it should be getting better and will get better. And I think that's a pretty fundamental divide. I mean, I would say it's pretty hard to predict which of these issues really ends up dividing and which ones get resolved. I mean, I do not think I would have predicted that 50 years after Roe, 40 years after Roe, I guess, 45 years, whatever it is, 46 years after Roe, I mean, it's still, I don't know if it's really a defining issue in the country exactly, but for politicians, it's one of the first things. You're either pro-life or pro-choice. Obviously, the court hearings, it's huge. Maybe if it just could, I mean, I tend to agree that if it were overturned, it would be extremely unpopular, and people are okay with the way it is, most people. And then you could make a sort of more fancier argument that if it were overturned, you'd have like 2 years of crazy, battles in every state. It would get resolved in every state, and most of the states would get resolved very quickly. In fact, it would not be a close vote in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Mississippi. On the other hand, which way it would go, and then it would be resolved. And maybe it would be actually better for our civic peace over the sort of medium long term. But it would be a very rough few years. On the other hand, it wasn't like gay rights and same-sex marriage supposed to be a huge issue, and a kind of key cultural moment. And is there anything more fundamental than the family? I mean, I was on the conservative side of most of these things, published plenty of articles about it, and they were all about, this is such a huge change. And I don't know, and here we are, and just, I mean, the funniest thing about Roe is, and it does show something about how issues matter, and it's not a matter of just technical. I mean, Roe is not settled law, I think it's fair to say, in a fundamental sense, or not. And Obergefell is. And Obergefell is 3 years ago. And in my opinion, is not a very easy to defend decision on any kind of originalist or whatever form, whatever you think of the merits of marriage equality or same-sex marriage. But it's, that issue is just like totally accepted. Is there a single conservative? I mean, I mean this literally. There were all these right-wing candidates all over the place screaming and yelling about this terrible caravan that was going to conquer America, and all kinds of, in my opinion, extremely irresponsible and demagogic arguments on many right-wing issues. Did any of them even mention marriage? I mean, so it just shows you can't quite tell what, maybe some other people who are smarter than I am can tell, but it's hard to tell ahead of time which of these issues gets kind of weirdly, peacefully resolved, you might say, and others become extremely irritant-like. I mean, immigration is the irritant. I guess that was predictable. You, Peter, sort of have predicted it for a while, but I don't know if it was entirely predictable. Empirically, if you look at the country, is it really causing such chaos and turmoil in the country? And large chunks of the country are moderately happy with the status quo. I mean, the system's broken, so that's a separate issue, but I don't know. I'm not sure I would have predicted that, Donald Trump would show up and suddenly would be having like wild kind of debates about the cultural aspects of immigration. I suppose, but maybe maybe that's happening everywhere, so maybe that does capture.
It is happening.
I don't know. Anyway, I just don't know.
Look, I think that there's a fairly straightforward explanation, because not all cultural and social issues are created equal. And because they are judged not only in the courts, but in the court of public opinion. I have never seen public opinion shift as rapidly on any important cultural issue as the case of same-sex marriage. 10 years ago, 1/3 of the population thought it was a good idea. Today, 2/3. And with every poll, that number creeps higher. So when the court resolves a cultural issue in a way that anticipates the flow of public opinion, then the issue becomes settled.
what is so striking about abortion is that public opinion on the, if you ask the question the right way, public opinion on that issue has been really quite constant. Right. In other words, the court intervened in the issue, but it did not settle the issue. And in many respects, the court, I think, ever since 1954, has been guided by a Brown v. Board template with regard to these difficult issues. And Brown, although it created an enormous amount of unavoidable social conflict in its wake, did end up resolving the fundamental moral issue, right? And all of the indicators about attitudes on racial questions have moved strongly in the Brown decision since that decision was handed down. And I think that led many practitioners of liberal jurisprudence to assume that once the court speaks, that is the moral voice of the country, and that's the end of the debate. And that's true except when it isn't. And abortion is the premier case of when it isn't. But there are others, but I absolutely agree with you about Obergefell. And interestingly, the leaders of the evangelical community have basically thrown in the towel on the issue. They no longer think they have a serious chance of turning that around.
Yeah.
Trump has divided three, and of course, we didn't recognize a resistance. I just media and media, but the divide media for.
Excuse me, the not really quite working.
Yeah, just keep it close to your.
Okay.
Don't move it back and forth.
Okay.
Just keep it close to you.
Just wanted to ask
No.
Kristol.
You have to hold it at the bottom, I think.
I wanted to ask Mr. Kristol whether President Trump has been a better or worse president than you thought when you opposed him, and I think I know the answer for Mr. Galston. So,
Well, I don't know if
That is your perfect
Well, I don't know if it's better or worse than he expected. He had, I don't know, honestly. I can't even remember anymore what I expected exactly. I mean, I would say I think he's been worse in this respect, that I did think there was a reasonable chance that once elected, he would think, gee, I'm president, and I have to not quite behave the way I've behaved as a candidate or for much of his life. That was probably an unrealistic expectation. But I don't know, it wasn't crazy. People do step up. I didn't expect him to step up, fully to the occasion, but I thought he might moderate himself, just be more presidential, as they say. That turned out to be not fundamentally true, I would say. I mean, the same things that worked for him as a candidate, and to some degree the same things that worked for him as a celebrity, he's happy to put to work for him as president. One of the most striking things about Trump, in a way that I really think is unprecedented in modern American politics, and maybe in all American history for a president, is the utter lack of distinction in his own mind between what it means to be president of the United States and what it means to be a candidate of one party for the presidency of the United States, and for that matter, what it means just to be a guy popping off on cable TV. It's all, at best, it's all the same for him. Maybe it's a little bit of a continuum, but it's not much of one. So in that respect, I think it's done a lot of damage in all kinds of ways. The institutions, I would say, have been, he's been constrained, on the other hand, maybe a little more than I might have expected by some of the people he put in there. He didn't turn out to actually have much, didn't really care enough, or didn't spend a lot of time finding people who were kindred spirits, except on one or two issues, including immigration. So that's where I guess come back to the immigration issue as sort of slightly unique, right? Stephen Miller there's only one Stephen Miller almost. I mean, on other issues, there really isn't much of a Stephen Miller. The most you get is like John Bolton or something. But even that's much more on the side of the mainstream, you might say, not sort of way out there in a way. And then a lot of the administration is, of course, staffed with establishment types and generals and stuff who restrain Trump. I would say my personal view is that he does feel, I don't know what he really thinks about what happened, but I think the Senate victories give him a sense that he did, he was able to boost his numbers and the body he cares more about. He followed his instincts, I think Bill's right about that, by playing the immigration card when everyone on TV was saying, you should talk more about the strong economy. And I don't know that he was wrong, I'm not sure that would have changed many votes in Northern Virginia, whereas I do think he probably did rally a little bit the votes for the Republican Senate challengers in Missouri and Indiana and elsewhere. They almost won Montana. They came pretty close to West Virginia. And so he feels a little unleashed. There's been turnover. There'll be turnover, obviously, yesterday with the Attorney General. And so I feel that the second 2 years could be in practice wilder than the first 2 years, whatever the rhetoric. I just think some of the people who were Don McGahn, John Kelly, Jeff Sessions, whatever you think of these individuals, and I have a mixed view of a lot of them, H.R. McMaster, there were a lot of people in there in pretty senior levels who prevented, we don't know how many, but my impression from conversations with some people very close to them is probably prevented more things from happening than we know about, and stopped a lot of sidetracked a lot of things, and diverted a lot of things, and kept policies closer to recognizable policies in all kinds of areas. A lot of those people are gone. They're not replaced by people of the same stature. They're not replaced by people whom Trump is a little bit in awe of or intimidated by, actually. And Trump himself feels a little more like he knows what he's doing. He's emboldened. So in that respect, I'm slightly worried, honestly, about the next.
Just policy.
This thing yesterday is a perfect example. Firing Sessions, fine. Attorney Generals come and go, and I'm not a huge Jeff Sessions fan, so I don't have a heart attack about it. I worry about Mueller, obviously, with the Rosenstein thing. But for me, what's more amazing is putting the Chief of Staff in as acting Attorney General. A, this is not a guy whom you would look at his resume and think, hey, yeah, this guy should be Attorney General of the United States. And B, it's really, it's of dubious constitutionality, in my view, to put a non-Senate confirmed person in to a head of a cabinet agency, especially to the Attorney General. The head of the whole Department of Justice is being run by someone who has never been confirmed by the Senate for anything. When, Richardson and Ruckelshaus quit in the Saturday Night Massacre, Bob Bork stepped up from being Solicitor General to being acting Attorney General. Bob Bork was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be Solicitor General. There was a certain kind of traditional accountability. He had gone through the key thing that the founders thought was necessary for having a position of responsibility of running a department, which is you need to come testify to the Senate, make commitments. And, of course, Bork famously committed that he would let the investigation go on with Jaworski and all that. We now have an acting Attorney General who was a staff guy. And that's a real, and Trump just did that. And no one at the White House, McGahn's not there anymore. Kelly told him he couldn't do it, he shouldn't do it. We'll see what happens in Congress, whether there's any real pushback. But that kind of just making the government more of a, personal fiefdom of Donald Trump's, as opposed to going, the normal institutional structures. I think we may see more of that over the next 2 years than we have.
Just quickly, policy-wise, are you surprised he's been so consistently conservative?
Yeah, I think the one issue on which he has, honestly, is obviously the judges. And there he just has had a slightly kind of genius of just deciding, I am not going to do anything. It's a little nuts in a way. I'm just going to take this list from this private organization. It's a good, there are a lot of distinguished people in that organization, but at the end of the day, they're putting people on, and I'm just going to pick my Supreme Court justices from that list, and on the appellate court, I'm going to take very standard conservative favorites. And he's been very disciplined on that, I would say. That's been striking to me. On other issues, he's been all over it depends what you mean by conservative, I guess, on some of these issues. He certainly abandoned entitlements, which was the one kind of the one moderate achievement of the Republican, of Paul Ryan as leader, as backbencher, then as was a Budget Committee chairman, and then as Speaker, obviously, was to kind of get the Republican Party on board some kind of entitlement reform. That's gone. So we now have two parties that have no interest in entitlement reform. We have, but the degree to, this is the cultural point, I've gone on too long, I'll stop. The degree to which the loyalty to Trump is now totally disassociated from most issues, I think with the exception of immigration, is really astonishing. When I just say to cause trouble to conservative audiences, you realize that the debt has gone up faster under Trump than it did under Obama. And we're at the end of the business cycle. Like, whatever you think of the stimulus, there was a case for really running a big deficit in 2009, 2010.
Now he tells us.
And what are we doing? And no one says anything about it. It has no resonance. You poll it a little bit. Republicans are a little bit unhappy about it. But you could go to a lot of I said before, no one's talked about same-sex marriage. You can go to watch a lot of campaign debates on C-SPAN this cycle and not hear a heck of a lot about the debt or the deficit, which was kind of an important argument in the Tea Party and in the Republican Party. That's what Paul Ryan was about. That was Paul Ryan's rise. The transformation of the Republican Party, I will say one more thing, just because it's, someone put it, I think having a conversation, we came up with this formulation. 2012, Paul Ryan's picked as Obama's VP. He's the rising star. Obama's the senior guy. He's the junior guy. He's an entitlement reform guy. He's a budget guy. He's just sort of conservative on social policy, but tolerant, you might say, and forward-looking, moderate, liberal, I would say, on immigration, et cetera, traditional foreign policy and all that. Trump is going around saying that we need to see Obama's birth certificate, right? And Trump was ridiculed by all of us in 2012, quite appropriately, I would say, and denounced even. And Ryan becomes the vice presidential nominee. 6 years later, Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and Paul Ryan is out of politics. It's really an astonishing change in 6 years in one of the two major parties.
I have a couple of things to say about your unexpectedly interesting question. One is.
Whoa. That was harsh.
No, it wasn't harsh. The more I thought about the question, the more interesting it became. That's what I'm saying. I am surprised. So first of all, I actually think that Donald Trump got to be the nominee of the party and then the president by making his peace with the building blocks of the Republican Party as he found it. And then adding a little special spice of his own, shall we say. To the cultural and religious conservatives, he said, you care about judges and your definition of religious liberty. I'm going to be with you on both of those. To the traditional sort of business conservatives, he said, you're interested in taxes and lower taxes and less regulation. I'll be with you on those subjects. To the Tea Party, he said, you're interested in repealing and replacing Obamacare and a change of course on immigration. I'm with you on those issues. And so he succeeded in the course of the presidential nominating process in taming portions of the Republican Party that might otherwise have opposed him very strongly by accepting their agendas as his agenda. And then he brought his own commitments, and the deal was, I'll accept you if you accept me. And he has got, to his credit, he has governed as he campaigned, and he hasn't done a lot since winning the election in November of 2016 that he didn't say he was going to do before that. I would say to a higher degree than many people who have attained the presidency. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think, and here I agree entirely with Bill Kay, that I am most surprised by his failure to assume the traditional trappings of presidential conduct, demeanor, and oratory. I think that is going to be a major issue in the 2020 presidential campaign. And I say that based on history. 1976, Jimmy Carter campaigns on the proposition that he's not going to lie to you. Under ordinary circumstances, that promise would have been meaningless. As a counterpoint to the Nixon era, it turned out to have substantial political power. In 2000, if memory serves, George W. Bush promised to restore honor and dignity to the Oval Office. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have meant very much, but in response to the deeds that occasioned the Clinton impeachment struggle, it had meaning. I think that in 2020, a smart Democratic candidate is going to do the 2020 version of pivoting off the portion of the Trump presidency that even many of his supporters really don't like. And I think that will be an important way of appealing to precisely the suburban voters who began to move away from the Republican Party in this election. And if anybody bothered to ask my opinion, I would strongly urge a presidential candidate to end every stump speech with a 2 or 3 minute litany on what he or she will or won't do as President of the United States. Each one of them is intended to contrast with a portion of President Trump's conduct that even his friends don't like.
I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a night. It's well after the time we were originally scheduled to end, and also our indefatigable and brilliant speakers could go on forever, and I apologize to those of you who didn't get to ask your questions, but please join me in thanking our speakers.